They came from quiet towns and crowded cities, from farms where the soil still clung to their boots, and from factories where the machines had already taught them the value of precision. They stepped forward not because they craved glory, but because something in them answered the pull of the deep, the promise that beneath the waves a man could still matter, could still strike back against a world that had once tried to break his country. One of them was a young mechanic named Ernst, 23 years old, with well-stained hands and a quiet way of listening before he spoke. He had grown up hearing his grandfather's stories of the old high-seas fleet, of ships that had steamed out proud and come home broken or never come home at all. When the call went out for volunteers willing to serve in the new submarine arm, Ernst did not hesitate long. The Navy offered steady pay, real training, and the chance to be part of something that felt alive again. His mother cried when he told her, but she packed his bag anyway and slipped a small wooden cross into the pocket of his civilian coat. "Come back to us," she said, and he nodded because he could not yet imagine any other ending. Another was a student from a university town, quiet and bookish, who had joined because he believed Germany deserved to hold her head up again. He had read about the old U-boat aces of the First War and saw in them a different kind of courage, not the thunder of big guns, but the patient, deadly patience of men who waited in the dark. He wrote long letters home in the beginning, describing the clean lines of the boats in the fitting-out yards, the way the diesel engines rumbled like distant thunder when they were tested. He did not yet write about the smell that never quite left your clothes, the diesel and sweat and battery acid that marked a man as belonging to the boats whether he wanted it or not. Their commander understood that smell better than any of them. Karl Dönitz had lived it once already, in another war, trapped inside a steel tube while depth charges rolled overhead like judgment. He had come back from that war with a conviction that would not leave him. The future of naval power did not lie with the great surface ships that could be seen and counted and sunk from afar. It lay with men who could disappear, who could wait, who could hunt together instead of alone. He gathered his young volunteers and spoke to them not as recruits but as the beginning of something that had never quite existed before. He told them the sea was vast, but a convoy was not. A single submarine could be driven off or destroyed by one determined escort. Several submarines, working in careful coordination, could appear from different directions at once, overwhelm the defenses, and vanish again before the enemy could gather his strength. He did not call it a tactic in those early days. He called it loyalty. He told them they would learn to trust one another in the dark the way wolves trust the pack, not because they were ordered to, but because each man's life would depend on the others doing exactly what they had promised to do. The training was harder than any of them had expected. The boats were small, the air grew thick quickly, and every drill carried the possibility that something could go wrong in ways that could not be fixed on the surface. Ernst remembered his first real dive more clearly than he remembered most days of his life. The boat tilted forward, the lights dimmed to red, and the hull began to creak in a language of its own. He stood at his station with sweat running down his back and his heart hammering so loudly he was certain the others could hear it. When the depth gauge finally steadied and the boat hung suspended in the cold water, someone, he never learned who, reached over and gave his shoulder a brief, wordless squeeze. That small pressure stayed with him longer than any lecture. It told him he was no longer alone in the dark. They trained in the Baltic and later in the colder waters farther north, practicing approaches on mock convoys made of fishing boats and old freighters. The exercises were exhausting, but they also created a strange, fierce affection among the crews. After a long night on the surface, when the sea had been rough and sleep impossible, men would share whatever small comforts they had, a piece of sausage saved from breakfast, a letter from home read aloud in the dim light of the control room because hearing another man's family made the loneliness smaller for everyone. One petty officer, older than most of them, had a habit of checking on the newest arrivals after particularly hard drills. He would sit with them in the narrow passage between the bunks and tell stories, not of glory but of the ordinary things that kept men sane, the way the sea sounded different at night, the small rituals that made a steel tube feel briefly like home. He never said the words, "I am afraid for you." He simply stayed until the shaking in their hands had eased. Dönitz watched all of this with the careful eye of a man who had already buried too many. He pushed them hard because he knew the sea would push harder. He rewarded precision and punished carelessness, but he also made time to speak with men individually when he could. To Ernst he once said, after watching him struggle with a stubborn valve during an exercise, "The boat does not care who you are on land. She only cares whether you will keep her alive when she needs you." Ernst carried that sentence with him for years afterward. It became a kind of private compass. There were losses even before the war began. A training accident here, a boat that surfaced too quickly there, a man who simply could not bear the confinement and asked to be transferred. Each time it happened, the others felt the space he left behind. They wrote letters to families they had never met, and they stood in silent groups on the pier when the news came. The grief was real, but so was the stubborn refusal to let it break the thing they were building together. In the evenings, when the work was done, they would sometimes gather on deck if the weather allowed and simply stand together in the salt air, not speaking much, just breathing air that did not taste of metal and oil. Those moments, more than any speech, taught them what Dönitz meant when he spoke of hunting as one. The world outside the training grounds was changing in ways they could feel even if they did not yet speak of it openly. New boats were being laid down in the yards. More volunteers arrived every month, some of them even younger than Ernst had been when he first reported. The older hands noticed the difference in the new men, a sharper edge of purpose, a quicker acceptance that this was no longer an experiment. It was becoming a force. Dönitz's idea of coordinated packs was no longer just an idea discussed in small rooms. It was being tested in larger and larger exercises, the boats learning to find one another in the dark by signal and by instinct, learning to close in on a target from several angles at once so that no single escort could drive them all away. Ernst wrote fewer letters home as the months passed, not because he had less to say but because the things he wanted to say were harder to put into words that would not worry his mother. He wrote instead about the way the boat felt alive beneath his feet when everything worked in rhythm, about the quiet pride he felt when a difficult approach went exactly as planned. He did not write about the nights when he lay in his narrow bunk listening to the hull creak and wondering whether he would ever see the fields again. Those thoughts he kept for himself, or shared only with the men who shared the same darkness. One evening, after a particularly long exercise in worsening weather, the student from the university town sat with Ernst on the narrow deck grating and asked him why he had stayed when so many others had found reasons to leave. Ernst thought for a long time before he answered. "Because when we are down there," he said at last, "and the lights are low and the only sound is the boat breathing, I know that the man next to me is doing exactly what I am doing. He is not thinking about running. He is thinking about keeping us all alive. I have never felt that anywhere else." The student nodded. He had no answer of his own yet, but he understood that something larger than any one man's fear was holding them together. Dönitz saw that same understanding growing in his crews. He knew better than most what it would cost when the time came to use it. He had already lived through one war in these boats. He had watched good men die because they were alone, because there had been no pack to come for them. That memory drove him now. He continued to refine the way his boats would work together, not on paper but in the cold water where mistakes could still be survived and learned from. He told his officers that the strength of the pack was not in any single boat's speed or in any single commander's daring. It was in the certainty that when one man made contact, the others would already be moving to support him. That certainty had to be built before the first shot was fired. It had to be earned in the long, uncomfortable hours of training when nothing was at stake except pride and the quiet respect of the men beside you. By the time the last of the pre-war exercises ended, the young men who had once stood awkwardly on cold piers had become something else. They still laughed at the same jokes. They still wrote letters that tried to sound braver than they felt. But they also carried themselves differently. They had learned the silence of the boats. They had learned the weight of trusting other men with their lives. And they had begun to believe, in the way that only men who have faced the same darkness together can believe, that what they were building might be strong enough to matter when the world finally asked it to. That belief would be tested sooner and more terribly than any of them could yet imagine. But in those last quiet months before everything changed, they still had the luxury of learning who they were becoming while the sea remained, for a little while longer, only a training ground instead of a battlefield. If these stories of ordinary men stepping into extraordinary courage have moved you the way they move me, then you'll understand why I want to share something with you. Dedicated World War II enthusiasts can discover authentic naval memorabilia, carefully researched books about the men who served at sea, and powerful films like Midway on Prime Video that honor the courage and sacrifice of sailors across every theater of the war. These are not just objects or stories, they are ways to keep the memory of that courage alive in our own hands and hearts. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The men who trained in those early boats did not yet know the full measure of what they would be asked to give. They only knew that they had chosen the deep, and that the deep had begun to choose them in return. They had built a brotherhood in the shadows, one that would soon be called upon to hunt in packs across an ocean that had no mercy for the unprepared. And when the order finally came to turn their training into war, they would carry with them not just their boats and their orders, but the quiet, unbreakable knowledge that the man beside them would do exactly what needed to be done, because that was the promise they had made to one another long before any torpedo was fired. The sea was waiting. And so were they. They came in the dark, through waters that were never meant to be crossed by an enemy, and the men who made that crossing carried with them the same quiet courage that had first drawn them to the boats, except now the stakes were no longer measured in training scores or the respect of their commander. Now they were measured in lives. The early weeks of the war had already shown how quickly the rules could change. A passenger liner carrying civilians had been sunk in the confusion of the first days, and the shock of those deaths had rippled far beyond the sea. It reminded everyone that even careful men could make terrible mistakes when the world was suddenly at war again. But that incident also hardened something in the young crews who had trained together in the years before. They understood now that the sea did not distinguish between intention and outcome. Once the torpedoes were in the water, the consequences belonged to everyone. One commander felt that weight more heavily than most. He was not the oldest or the most experienced, but he carried a restless energy that made other men follow him without question. He had volunteered for the submarines because he believed they offered the only real chance for a smaller navy to strike back against a larger one. His name was spoken with a mixture of admiration and concern among his peers. They knew he was the kind of man who would push a boat and its crew right to the edge of what was possible, and sometimes beyond. When the chance came to attempt something that most officers considered suicidal, to slip inside the main British fleet anchorage in the far north and strike at the heart of the enemy navy, he stepped forward without hesitation. He gathered his crew and told them plainly what they were being asked to do. There would be no promises of safety, only the certainty that if they succeeded, the world would know that no harbor was truly beyond reach. The men who served under him were the same generation that had trained in the pre-war years, mechanics and students and farm boys who had learned to trust one another in the cramped spaces of the boats. They had already completed several patrols, learning the difference between the controlled danger of exercises and the unpredictable reality of war. Some of them had written letters home describing the strange mixture of boredom and sudden terror that came with hunting on the surface. Others had simply stopped writing as often, because the things they now carried inside were harder to explain to people who had never felt a hull shudder from a distant explosion. When their commander told them the plan, they did not cheer or boast. They checked their equipment with extra care, spoke in lower voices, and found small ways to steady one another. One man quietly passed a photograph around the tiny mess area so that every crew member could see the face of his wife and children. Another spent extra time on the torpedoes, making sure every setting was perfect, as if precision could somehow protect them from what lay ahead. The approach itself was an act of nerve that few men could have sustained. They moved mostly on the surface under cover of darkness, slipping through narrow channels where the water was shallow and the currents unpredictable. At times they could hear the sound of patrol boats in the distance or see the faint glow of searchlights sweeping across the horizon. Inside the boat the air grew thick with the smell of diesel and the tension that no one wanted to name. The commander stayed at the periscope for long stretches, giving quiet orders that kept them on course. When they finally passed through the last line of defenses and entered the wide, sheltered waters of the anchorage, the men allowed themselves the smallest breath of relief, only to realize that the hardest part was still ahead. The great ships of the British fleet lay at anchor like sleeping giants, their outlines barely visible against the darker hills. The crew could feel the weight of what they were about to do. They were not attacking a convoy or a lone merchantman. They were inside the enemy's most protected place, and every minute they remained increased the chance that someone on those decks would notice a shadow that did not belong. The commander chose his target carefully. One of the largest battleships lay ahead, a symbol of power and tradition. He brought the boat into position with painstaking patience, waiting for the right angle and the right moment. When the order came to fire, the torpedoes left the tubes with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. For several long seconds nothing happened. Then the night erupted. A massive explosion rolled across the water, followed by a second and then a third as the remaining torpedoes found their mark. The great ship shuddered and began to list almost immediately. Men who had been asleep or writing letters or playing cards in the mess decks were thrown from their bunks or sent scrambling through darkened passageways as the hull tilted beneath them. The sea rushed in through the wounds in her side, and the cold northern water claimed the lower decks with terrifying speed. On board the submarine the crew felt a complicated surge of emotion, triumph at having struck such a blow, and a sudden, sobering awareness of what that blow had cost in human lives. They could see the ship settling, could hear the distant shouts and the alarms, and they knew that hundreds of men were now fighting for their lives in the dark water. There was no time for reflection. The commander gave the order to withdraw, and they began the long, dangerous journey back out through the same narrow channels they had used to enter. Depth charges were already rolling in the distance as the British forces reacted, and every man inside the boat braced for the shock waves that could crush them if they came too close. They ran on the surface when they could, dived when they had to, and trusted the same coordination and discipline they had practiced for years. When they finally reached safer water and surfaced again under the open sky, the exhaustion hit them all at once. Some men simply sat where they were and stared at nothing. Others found themselves shaking and could not stop. The news of what had happened spread faster than the submarine could return. In Britain, the loss of such a powerful ship inside its own main anchorage sent a wave of shock and anger through the Navy and the public. Families received telegrams in the middle of the night. Wives and mothers and children tried to understand how a vessel that had survived the previous war could be taken so suddenly in a place everyone had believed was safe. Survivors who had been pulled from the freezing water spoke of the chaos, the way the lights had failed, the way the decks had tilted so steeply that men slid past one another without being able to help, the terrible sound of the ship dying beneath them. Acts of quiet heroism emerged in the telling, men who stayed at their posts to help others escape, officers who gave up their life jackets, strangers who held onto each other in the dark until rescue boats arrived. Those stories became part of the national memory of that night, a reminder that even in the worst moments ordinary sailors could still choose courage over panic. In Germany the reaction was very different. The commander and his crew were received as heroes. There were official welcomes, photographs, and public declarations that turned the raid into proof that the submarine arm could strike anywhere. The young men who had trained together in the years before the war now saw one of their own elevated to a level of fame that most of them could scarcely imagine. Letters arrived from families who had once worried about their sons choosing such a dangerous service and who now wrote with a mixture of pride and renewed fear. The commander himself moved through the celebrations with a certain reserve. He accepted the praise because it belonged to his crew as much as to him, but he also understood that the raid had changed the war in ways that would not be kind to either side. He had proven that even the strongest fleet could be reached. He had also reminded everyone that when a battleship goes down in minutes, the cost is measured in hundreds of ordinary lives cut short. For the crew who had made the journey with him, the return brought its own quiet struggles. Some could not sleep without seeing the image of the sinking ship. Others found themselves unable to explain to friends and family what it had felt like to be inside that small steel world while history was being made around them. One young crew member wrote a letter to his parents in which he tried to describe the moment the explosions lit up the night. He wrote about the pride he felt in his commander and his shipmates, but he also wrote about the cold that had seemed to reach inside the boat afterward, as if the sea itself were angry at what they had done. He folded the letter carefully and carried it with him for days before he finally posted it, unsure whether the words captured even a fraction of what he had lived through. The raid did more than sink a ship. It forced both sides to see the war at sea in a new light. The British, who had expected the main threat to come from surface raiders and aircraft, now had to confront the reality that determined men in small submarines could reach places previously considered untouchable. Harbor defenses were strengthened, nets were doubled, patrols increased, and the fleet itself began to move more cautiously. In Germany, the success gave the submarine service a surge of confidence and new volunteers. Young men who had been watching from the training grounds now stepped forward in greater numbers, inspired by the proof that skill and daring could overcome even the most formidable defenses. The idea that submarines could hunt together in coordinated packs was still taking shape, but this single, audacious strike showed what individual commanders and their crews were capable of achieving. It also showed the terrible price that would be paid on both sides whenever those capabilities were used. The commander who had led the raid would go on to other missions, carrying the weight of that night with him. His crew would scatter to other boats or stay together for a time, bound by what they had shared. The men who had survived the sinking would carry their own memories of sudden darkness, of friends lost in the cold, of the strange luck that had let them live when so many others had not. And across the sea that separated the two nations, families on both sides would continue to receive letters or telegrams, to grieve or to hope, to try to make sense of a war that had already begun to demand more from ordinary people than anyone had expected. If the human cost of nights like this one, the courage it took to attempt the impossible and the suffering that followed when it succeeded, has stayed with you, then you may want to see the realities that official accounts often leave out. Our special Gumroad collection holds raw, uncensored photographs and rare footage from the U-boat campaign, material too visceral and heartbreaking to show on this platform. These images capture the true face of submarine warfare in ways that words alone cannot, offering an unflinching look at the courage, the destruction, and the quiet aftermath that shaped so many lives. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The young men who had once trained together now understood that the sea they had chosen would not give back what it took. The commander who had led them through the impossible had shown that even the strongest anchors could be cut. But he had also shown that every victory carried its own shadow, and that the men who lived through such nights would never again see the water in quite the same way. The war at sea had found its first true legend, and with that legend came the knowledge that the struggle was only beginning. The boats were still small, the crews still young, and the ocean still vast enough to hide both hunters and the hunted for a long time to come. What they would do with that knowledge, and what it would cost them, remained to be seen in the months and years that lay ahead. The Atlantic shore had changed hands, and with it something fundamental shifted in the long, invisible war that was unfolding beneath the waves. The men who had trained in the shadowed years before and who had already tasted the first bitter realities of combat now found themselves moving into a new kind of home, one that brought them closer to the hunting grounds than they had ever imagined possible. They arrived in small groups at first, the crews of boats that had been operating from German ports and that were now being redirected westward. The journey itself felt like a strange dream. Some traveled overland through a France that still smelled of recent fighting, past villages where people watched them pass with faces that showed everything from quiet resentment to weary acceptance. Others brought their boats around the long way, slipping along the coast under cover of night or fog, feeling the weight of the new orders in every mile. When they finally reached the western ports, places like Lorient and Brest that had once belonged to the French Navy, the men stepped ashore into a world that was at once familiar and completely foreign. The sea air was the same, thick with salt and the promise of weather. But the flags were different, the language in the streets was different, and the concrete shelters that were already rising along the waterfront spoke of a permanence that none of them had expected so soon. One of the men who made that transition was Ernst, the quiet mechanic who had first volunteered because he wanted steady work and a chance to matter. He had already been through the early patrols and had felt the shock of the opening weeks of war. Now, as he walked the quays of his new base for the first time, he carried a letter from his mother that he had not yet opened. She had written about the garden back home and about how the neighbors asked after him. He had not written back in weeks because the things he wanted to say felt too large for paper. Standing on the French dock, watching other crews unloading gear and greeting one another with the rough affection of men who had shared too many cramped nights, he felt a sudden, unexpected sense of belonging. This was not home in the old sense. But it was a place where the boats mattered more than anything else, and where the men who sailed them were beginning to understand that they were no longer training for something. They were living it. The bases themselves were transforming almost overnight. The French had left behind workshops and slips and warehouses, and now those spaces were being turned to a single purpose. Work crews, some local, some brought in, labored day and night on the massive concrete shelters that would eventually protect the boats from the air. In the meantime, the submarines tied up alongside the old French warships or in hastily cleared berths, their gray hulls reflecting the changing light of the Atlantic. The men moved between their boats and the shore with a new rhythm. There were proper meals in the messes, real beds between patrols, and the strange luxury of being able to step off the boat without immediately facing another long transit across the North Sea. That extra time on station, that ability to reach farther into the Atlantic without exhausting the crew or the fuel, changed everything about how they hunted. Dönitz understood the shift better than anyone. From his headquarters he began to direct his commanders with a new clarity. No longer would the boats operate mostly alone, hoping to stumble across a target. Now they would be sent in groups, coordinated by radio, told to find a convoy and then to attack together from different angles and at different times. The idea that had been practiced in exercises before the war was finally being put to the test in the open ocean. The commanders who received those orders felt the weight of the new responsibility. Some of them were still young, still carrying the memory of their first patrols, and now they were being asked to think not only of their own boat but of the others moving unseen through the same waters. The radio became their lifeline. A single sighting could bring several boats converging on the same patch of sea, and the men inside each hull had to trust that the others would do exactly what they had been told, even when they could not see one another, even when the sea was doing its best to scatter them. The first coordinated attacks brought a mixture of triumph and sobering reflection. On one such night a group of boats found a slow convoy making its way eastward. The sea was rough, the visibility poor, and the escorts were stretched thin. From inside one of the attacking submarines the men could hear the distant rumble of engines and the occasional flash of signal lights on the horizon. The commander gave quiet orders, and the boat slipped closer. When the first torpedo was fired, the crew felt the familiar lurch and then the long, tense wait. The explosion, when it came, was distant but unmistakable, a dull concussion that traveled through the water and into the hull. Other explosions followed from other directions as the pack closed in. On the merchant ships the night turned into chaos. Men who had been standing watch or sleeping in their bunks were thrown into the cold water as their vessels broke apart. Some managed to launch lifeboats in the darkness. Others clung to wreckage and called for friends they could no longer see. The escorts raced back and forth, dropping charges that shook the sea and forced the submarines to dive or maneuver desperately. In the middle of it all, ordinary men on both sides made the small choices that survival sometimes depended on, a sailor giving his life jacket to a younger shipmate, a submarine crew member steadying a frightened shipmate with a hand on the shoulder and a few quiet words. When the surviving boats returned to the French bases days later, the men stepped ashore changed in ways they did not always have words for. There was pride in what they had accomplished together. The pack had worked. Convoys that might once have passed with only scattered losses were now being hit harder and more often. But there was also the knowledge that the sea had taken its own toll. Some boats had not come back. Some men who had shared meals and watches and the small kindnesses of cramped quarters were gone, and the empty places at the tables in the mess halls spoke more loudly than any announcement. Ernst found himself sitting with a group of survivors from another boat one evening, listening as they described the last moments of a friend who had stayed at his post during a depth charge attack. No one glorified it. They simply told the story and then sat in silence for a while, each man carrying his own private version of the same truth, that the pack could bring victory, but it could not guarantee that everyone would come home. The French ports themselves became a strange mixture of military purpose and ordinary human life. The local people watched the new arrivals with careful eyes. Some kept their distance, remembering that their own navy had been defeated and that these gray boats now used the same waters their sons and brothers had once sailed. Others found small ways to interact, a cafe owner who served coffee and bread to the crews without asking too many questions, a shopkeeper who learned a few words of German so he could sell cigarettes and soap. There were moments of unexpected kindness. A young French woman who worked in one of the port offices helped a German sailor write a letter home when he could not find the right words. She did not ask about the war. She simply listened and then offered the quiet suggestion that sometimes the simplest truth was enough. The sailor carried that letter with him on his next patrol, and when he returned weeks later he brought her a small shell he had found on a distant beach, polished smooth by the sea. It was a tiny gesture in a vast conflict, but it reminded both of them that even in occupied territory, two people could still choose to see each other as human. For the crews, the time between patrols became precious in ways it had never been before. They wrote longer letters. They slept without the constant vibration of engines. They walked the streets of the port towns and tried to remember what it felt like to be somewhere that was not made of steel. Some of them fell in love, or thought they did, with the sudden intensity of men who knew they might not have another chance. Others simply sat together in the evenings and talked about home, about the farms or factories or university halls they had left behind, and about the families who were waiting without knowing exactly what their sons and husbands were now doing. Those conversations were a kind of quiet resilience. They did not erase the fear that came with every new sailing order, but they made the fear bearable because it was shared. On the other side of the ocean, the impact of the new bases was felt in every convoy that sailed. Merchant captains who had once worried mainly about the weather and the occasional lone submarine now had to reckon with the possibility that several boats might be waiting for them in the same stretch of water. The escorts worked harder, stretching their patrols thinner, learning new tactics even as the losses mounted. Families at home received news of ships that had simply disappeared, and the not knowing was sometimes worse than the certainty. Yet even in that strain there were stories of endurance, crews that stayed at their posts through torpedo attacks, men who launched lifeboats under fire and then went back for others, captains who kept their vessels in formation even when everything around them was burning. Those small acts of courage became the threads that held the convoys together when the sea and the hunters were doing their best to pull them apart. Dönitz watched all of this from his headquarters and continued to refine the way his packs operated. He knew that the advantage of the French bases would not last forever. The enemy would adapt, and the air threat would grow, and the concrete shelters would one day be tested. But for now the boats were reaching farther, staying longer, and striking harder than they ever had before. The men who sailed them were learning what it meant to be part of something larger than a single hull. They were learning to trust the voice on the radio as much as they trusted the man standing next to them in the control room. And they were learning, in the small hours between patrols, that even in a war that seemed to have no end in sight, there were still moments of ordinary human connection that could make the next departure feel possible. Ernst stood on the dock one evening before another sailing and opened the letter from his mother that he had carried for weeks. She had written that the garden was doing well and that she hoped he was eating properly. At the bottom she had added a single line in her careful handwriting: "Whatever you are doing, know that we are proud of you and that we are waiting." He folded the letter and put it back in his pocket, then looked out at the gray shapes of the boats tied along the quay. The Atlantic was waiting too, vast and cold and full of both danger and purpose. He turned and walked back toward his boat, where the rest of the crew was already making ready. Somewhere out there other packs were moving, other men were writing their own letters or saying their own quiet goodbyes, and the long struggle for the lifeblood of nations was entering a new and more relentless phase. The wolves had found their shore, and the flocks were learning that the sea was no longer big enough to hide them. The stories of these men, the ones who left everything familiar to serve in steel tubes far from home, the ones who coordinated in the dark because their lives depended on it, and the ones on the other side who refused to break even when the night turned against them, deserve to be remembered with the care they earned. Keeping those voices alive, finding the letters and the memories and the small moments that reveal what this war actually cost ordinary people, takes time and dedication that goes far beyond any single telling. If this story has stayed with you and you want to help sustain the research, the survivor interviews, and the careful work of bringing these forgotten chapters back into the light, you can leave a small tip, even just $1, on Ko-Fi. It makes a real difference in allowing us to keep going. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The French bases had done more than shorten the distance to the hunting grounds. They had given the men who sailed from them a new sense of what was possible when skill, trust, and coordination came together. The packs were no longer an idea practiced in exercises. They were a living reality that was reshaping the Atlantic night by night. And the young men who had once stood on cold piers wondering what the deep would ask of them were now discovering the answer in the longest, hardest way imaginable, together. The war at sea had found its rhythm, and that rhythm would only grow more demanding in the months ahead. But for now, in the ports along the Atlantic shore, the boats rested, the crews prepared, and the sea waited for whatever the next patrol would bring. They became legends while they were still breathing, these commanders who seemed to carry their own weather with them across the Atlantic. Men spoke their names in the French ports with a mixture of pride and something closer to superstition, as if saying the words too loudly might summon the sea to take them back. Yet every one of them knew, in the quiet hours between patrols, that the same ocean that gave them their victories was already keeping a list of those it meant to claim. The French bases had turned the long hunt into something almost routine for those who survived the learning curve. Boats could reach the convoy routes faster, stay longer, and return with fuel and torpedoes still in reserve. What had once been desperate individual chases now had the shape of something larger, packs that could be directed, coordinated, and concentrated where the prey was thickest. In that new rhythm certain men rose faster than others. They were not braver than the crews they led, nor were they immune to the same fears that kept other men awake in their bunks. What set them apart was a particular clarity under pressure, a feel for the dark water and the patterns of the convoys, and the rare ability to make the men around them believe that following this commander might be the difference between coming home and becoming another name on a memorial. One of them moved through the base at Lorient with a quiet that made other officers notice him even when he said little. He was methodical, almost scholarly in the way he studied the reports that came back from other boats. He preferred night surface attacks when the sea allowed it, slipping close to a convoy under cover of darkness, firing carefully aimed torpedoes, and then disappearing before the escorts could organize a proper hunt. His crew learned to read his silences. When he stood at the periscope for a long time without speaking, they knew he was measuring not only the target but the risk to every man on board. He wrote letters home that were short and practical, the kind a man writes when he does not want to burden those who love him with the things he cannot change. Yet in the mess he would sometimes sit with a junior officer who was struggling after a difficult patrol and speak with unexpected gentleness about the difference between luck and preparation. The younger man would leave those conversations steadier, carrying the strange comfort that came from knowing even the most successful commanders still carried doubts. Another commander carried himself with more visible fire. He had a gift for making the dangerous seem almost playful, and his crew responded to that energy with a fierce loyalty that sometimes bordered on hero worship. He liked to be among his men after a successful patrol, buying drinks, telling stories that grew slightly larger with each telling, yet never quite crossing into falsehood. The rivalry between these two was real but never bitter. They respected each other's methods even when they disagreed on the best way to approach a convoy. In the evenings at the base they might find themselves at the same table, arguing tactics with the intensity of men who knew that the next patrol could turn an argument into a matter of life and death. When one of them returned from a particularly hard voyage, the other would be waiting on the quay with a bottle and a few quiet words that meant more than any official welcome. The crews who served under these men lived in the strange space between ordinary young sailors and something closer to a chosen family. Many of them had come from the same training grounds where the idea of the pack had first been practiced. They had already lost friends in the early months of the war, and that shared grief had welded them together in ways no drill could have achieved. On a successful patrol, the boat could feel almost alive with purpose, the lookouts calling sightings in low voices, the torpedo men moving with the calm precision that came from having done the same thing many times before, the commander's quiet orders creating a kind of shared concentration that made the cramped space feel larger than it was. After the attack, when the boat was running deep or racing away on the surface, there would be a moment when the tension broke and someone would pass around a piece of chocolate saved from the last shore leave or tell a joke that had no business being funny in that place. Those small kindnesses mattered more than anyone admitted. They reminded the men that they were still human even when the sea was trying to turn them into something else. Yet the sea kept its own accounting. Even in the months when the packs were sinking more tonnage than the shipyards could replace, boats were still being lost. Sometimes it was a depth charge attack that went on too long. Sometimes it was a mine or a collision and poor visibility. Sometimes it was simply the accumulated exhaustion of too many nights on the surface and too many days without proper rest. When a boat failed to return, the base felt the absence like a sudden drop in air pressure. The men who had shared watches with the missing crew would gather in small groups on the quay or in the mess, speaking in the low voices people use when they are trying not to disturb the dead. Letters would be written to families who did not yet know. Photographs would be collected and sent home with careful notes about how their son or husband had been a good shipmate and a steady hand in difficult moments. The aces themselves felt these losses more sharply than most. One of them, after learning that a boat he had often worked with was overdue and presumed lost, sat alone in his cabin for a long time before emerging to speak with his own crew. He did not give a speech. He simply told them the truth as he knew it and then asked them to look after one another a little more carefully on the next patrol. The men who heard him understood that the glory everyone talked about on shore was only half the story. The other half was written in the empty bunks and the letters that would never be answered. The success of those months created its own kind of pressure. The commanders who were bringing in the biggest scores found themselves celebrated in ways that sometimes made them uncomfortable. There were photographs and articles and official visits that turned men who preferred the quiet discipline of the control room into public symbols. Some of them handled it with grace, using the attention to argue for better equipment or more boats. Others carried the weight of it privately, knowing that every headline increased the expectation that they would keep performing at the same level. The crews watched their commanders navigate this new attention and learned something about the difference between being respected by your own men and being turned into a story for people who had never smelled diesel in a confined space or felt the hull shudder from a close depth charge. The men who stayed grounded were the ones who continued to eat the same food as their crews and to listen when a junior rating had something to say about a valve that needed attention or a watch that had been too long. On the other side of the ocean, the impact of these packs was measured in different ways. Merchant sailors who had once spoken of submarines as an occasional hazard now lived with the constant possibility that any night could bring multiple attackers appearing from different directions. The escorts worked harder than ever, learning to use the new radio direction-finding equipment and to keep their charges in tighter formations even when the sea tried to scatter them. There were nights when a single well-handled escort group could drive off an entire pack, and those small victories mattered enormously to the men who achieved them. They became stories passed from ship to ship, the night the corvette turned back 3 boats in succession. The afternoon the destroyer stayed with a crippled merchantman long after the rest of the convoy had moved on. These moments of everyday heroism did not make the headlines the way the aces did, but they kept the lifeblood of the Allied nations moving across the water when everything seemed stacked against them. The letters that traveled between the bases and the homes far away carried more truth than the official accounts. A young crew member might write about the pride he felt when his boat came home with another victory pennant flying, and then, in the same letter, describe the way the sea had looked after a torpedo hit, the debris, the oil, the small dark shapes that might have been men or might have been something else. He would ask his family not to worry and then, almost as an afterthought, mention that one of the other boats had not returned and that the empty place at the table still felt wrong. His mother, reading those lines in a kitchen far from the sea, would fold the letter carefully and place it with the others, understanding that her son was trying to give her both the glory and the ghosts in the same envelope. Even the most successful commanders carried their own private reckonings. One of them, after a particularly long and difficult patrol, found himself unable to sleep even though the boat was safely tied up and the base was quiet. He walked the deck in the early hours and thought about the men who had not come back, about the families who would never receive the letters he had helped write, and about the simple fact that the sea did not care how many ships a man had sunk or how many crews he had brought home. When he finally returned to his cabin, he wrote a letter of his own, not to his family, but to the widow of a fellow commander who had been lost weeks earlier. He did not try to explain why one boat had survived and another had not. He simply told her that her husband had been a good man and a steady officer and that his crew had spoken well of him to the end. It was a small act, the kind that does not appear in any official record, but it was the kind of thing that kept the living connected to the dead in ways that made the next sailing possible. The packs were working. The tonnage figures were climbing. The men who had once trained in the Baltic were now operating with a confidence that came from repeated success. Yet even in those months the signs were already present that the advantage would not last forever. The escorts were learning. The air cover was beginning to stretch farther. And the sea itself continued to take its toll regardless of which side held the upper hand on any given night. The aces and their crews lived inside that contradiction every day, celebrated on shore, tested to the limit at sea, bound together by the knowledge that the next patrol could turn any one of them into a ghost that the others would carry for the rest of their lives. If the personal letters, the quiet rivalries that were also deep friendships, and the private reckonings of these men have made you want to go deeper into the human reality behind the legends, then our Patreon community is built exactly for that. History lovers there gain access to uncensored deep dive podcasts, raw video segments without any blurring, exclusive collections of survivor letters, and a warm circle of fellow enthusiasts who refuse to let these stories fade into statistics. It is a place where the full weight of what these crews lived through can be explored together. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The first happy time was never only about the numbers of ships sunk or the names that appeared in the newspapers. It was about men who had chosen the boats when the choice still felt like an adventure and who were now learning, patrol by patrol, what that choice actually demanded of them. They celebrated their victories because the victories were real and hard-won. They mourned their losses because the losses were also real and could not be replaced by any amount of success. And they kept sailing because the pack, for all its dangers, had become the only place where they truly belonged. The Atlantic was still vast, but it was no longer large enough to hide either the hunters or the hunted from what was coming next. The ghosts were already gathering, and the men who had turned the early months of the war into their own kind of legend would soon discover that even the most successful packs eventually meet a sea that refuses to be mastered. In the middle of an ordinary Atlantic patrol, a boat that had been hunting with the cold efficiency its crew had trained for suddenly found itself fighting for its own life, and the prize the enemy took from her that day was not measured in steel or fuel, but in something far more fragile and far more powerful: the quiet certainty that men on one side could read what men on the other side believed was unbreakable. The crew of that boat had left their French base in the same mood as so many others during those months. They were young, most of them, and they carried the strange mixture of pride and private fear that came with knowing they were part of something the enemy was beginning to fear. Their commander was a man who had already earned a reputation for boldness. He had taken his boat into dangerous waters before and brought it home. On this patrol the sea had been generous at first. They had found a convoy, worked with other boats in the pack, and sent torpedoes on their way with the careful coordination that had become almost second nature. The men moved through their duties with the quiet competence of people who trusted one another in the dark. A young rating who had joined only a few months earlier found himself steadied by the calm voice of the petty officer beside him when the depth charges first began to roll. Another man, writing a letter in his head that he would never finish, kept thinking about the girl he had met in the port cafe and the way she had smiled when he tried to speak her language. Then the attack came. The escorts had been more alert than expected. Depth charges bracketed the boat with a violence that shook every rivet and sent men staggering against the bulkheads. Lights flickered. The hull groaned in a language no one wanted to hear. The commander made the decisions he had been trained to make: dive deeper, turn, try to slip away, but the sea and the men above it would not let them go. Damage mounted. The boat began to take on water. When it finally became clear that they could no longer stay submerged without drowning, the order was given to surface. The men climbed through the hatches into the cold air and the sudden, blinding reality of daylight. Some carried nothing but the clothes they wore. Others grabbed what they could: a photograph, a letter, a small token from home, before the water claimed the rest. The commander stood on the bridge for a moment longer than he needed to, making sure every man who could still move had left the boat. Then he gave the order that no commander ever wants to give. They abandoned ship. In the water they watched their boat drift, damaged but still afloat, and felt the strange mixture of relief and grief that comes when the thing that has been both prison and protector is suddenly no longer theirs. They did not yet know that the enemy had already decided this particular boat was worth more than a quick sinking. On the British destroyer that had led the hunt, the decision was being made in the space of minutes. The captain understood what an intact submarine could mean. He also understood what boarding one could cost. The boat was still moving, still potentially dangerous, and every man who volunteered knew they might be stepping onto a vessel rigged to explode or already filling with water that would take them down with it. Yet hands went up. A young lieutenant was chosen to lead the party. He gathered a small group of sailors who had shown steady nerves in earlier actions and told them plainly what they were being asked to do. There would be no time for hesitation once they were alongside. They would have to move fast, trust one another completely, and accept that the boat might sink beneath them at any moment. They lowered a boat and rowed across the short stretch of water that now separated hunter from hunted. The sea was not calm. Spray slapped their faces. The damaged submarine loomed larger with every stroke, its hull scarred from the depth charges, water sloshing inside the open hatches. When they reached the side, the lieutenant climbed first, moving carefully onto the slippery deck. The others followed, hearts pounding, every sense sharpened by the knowledge that they were now inside enemy territory in the most literal way. The interior of the boat was a place of shadows and strange smells, diesel, sweat, battery acid, and the metallic tang of fear that lingers after men have fought for their lives. They moved through the narrow passages with flashlights, stepping over debris, listening for any sound that might mean someone had stayed behind or that a trap had been set. In the control room they found what they had hoped for and what they had dreaded in equal measure. The cipher machine still bolted in place, its rotors set to the current day's configuration, and beside it the books that contained the daily settings and the keys that made the whole system work. They worked quickly, gathering everything they could carry, aware that the boat was settling lower in the water with every passing minute. One sailor paused for a second beside a photograph someone had left behind, a young woman smiling in a summer dress, then tucked it gently into a pocket to be returned later if possible. Another helped steady a shipmate whose hands were shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. Small acts of care in a place where care had no official place. On the surface, the German crew in the water watched in horror and fury as figures moved across their boat. Some shouted. Others simply stared, unable to believe that the enemy had dared to board what should have been a tomb or a prize they themselves had denied. The commander, treading water among his men, felt the full weight of what was happening. He had given the order to abandon because staying meant death. Now he watched strangers take from his boat the very thing that had allowed his pack to hunt so effectively, the invisible shield of secrecy that had let them appear where they were least expected. He could not know yet how much had been taken, but he knew enough to understand that something irreplaceable was being carried away. When the British boat finally pulled alongside to take the survivors aboard, the German crew climbed the nets with the exhausted obedience of men who had already lost the thing that mattered most. They were treated with the rough courtesy of men who had been through the same sea. Blankets were passed. Hot drinks were offered. A British sailor helped a young German raiding who was shivering so hard he could barely grip the rope. For a few minutes the war felt smaller than the cold and the shared relief of still being alive. The materials reached Bletchley Park in conditions of absolute secrecy. The people who worked there had been laboring for months in a world of paper, mathematics, and quiet desperation, trying to find patterns in what looked like random letters. They lived in a strange half-light, brilliant minds working long hours in wooden huts, surrounded by the constant sound of machines and the knowledge that every decoded message could save ships and lives. Yet they could never speak of what they did outside those huts. When the captured machine and the books arrived, the effect was immediate and electric. The daily settings gave them the key they had been missing. Suddenly the traffic that had been dark for so long began to speak. Men and women who had been staring at pages of apparent nonsense found themselves reading the actual orders and positions of the very boats that had been hunting the convoys. The relief was enormous. The burden was heavier than before. They knew now that they could warn the convoys, reroute them around the waiting packs, and do it in ways that would not reveal how the information had been obtained. But they also knew that if the enemy ever suspected what had happened, the advantage would vanish in an instant. The secrecy became even more absolute. Commanders at sea received routing instructions without ever being told why those routes were safe. The men and women at Bletchley carried the knowledge alone. One of the analysts who worked on the first messages from the captured material sat for a long time after the breakthrough, staring at the decoded text. She had a brother serving in the merchant navy. She had not heard from him in weeks. Now, looking at the positions and intentions of the boats that had been hunting his possible routes, she felt both the power and the loneliness of the work. She could not write to him. She could not tell anyone outside the hut what she had seen. All she could do was pass the information upward and hope that somewhere, on some ship, a young man who shared her blood would benefit from a course change he would never understand. Later she wrote a letter to her family that said only that she was well and that the work was important. She did not mention the photograph she kept in her drawer, her brother in uniform, smiling on a dock before he sailed, or the way she sometimes touched it before beginning a new shift. On the German side, the loss of the boat and its secrets was felt as a sharp but contained blow. The commander and his surviving crew were interrogated, but they had followed their orders. They had destroyed what they could and abandoned what they could not save. They did not know, and could not have known, how much had actually been taken or how it would be used. When they returned to base, some of them were given new boats. Others were sent to different duties. The young rating who had been helped aboard the British destroyer carried with him the memory of that small kindness, a blanket, a hot drink, a hand steadying him on the net, and wondered, in the quiet moments, whether the war would ever allow such gestures again. He wrote to his family about the patrol but said nothing about the boarding. There were no words for the feeling of watching strangers walk through the spaces where he had slept and eaten and tried to stay alive. The capture changed the rhythm of the packs in ways the men at sea could not yet see. Convoys that should have been found were suddenly harder to locate. Attacks that had once come with almost predictable regularity now met empty water or stronger escorts that seemed to know where to be. The aces who had been so successful in the earlier months found themselves working harder for smaller results. They attributed it to better enemy tactics, to more air cover, to the simple luck of war. They did not know that in a quiet room far from the sea, people they would never meet were reading their orders before they were even carried out. The secret held because the people who knew it understood what would happen if it broke. The boarding party had risked their lives for a few hours on a sinking boat. The codebreakers risked their sanity and their futures every day by carrying knowledge they could never share. Both groups acted out of the same belief that some things are worth protecting even when the cost is measured in silence and in the private weight of what cannot be spoken. If the courage of men who climbed aboard a sinking enemy submarine and the quiet, relentless work of those who turned captured secrets into lives saved have left you wanting to explore more of the hidden operations that shaped this war, then I have something valuable to share with you. Our free email newsletter will bring you the exclusive ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, including the full hidden story of the Enigma captures, along with weekly dispatches that reveal the espionage, the courage, and the forgotten heroes who worked in the shadows behind the headlines. It is the perfect way to keep these stories alive in your own inbox. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The boat that had once been a hunter became, in its final hours, something else entirely, a vessel carrying a prize that no depth charge could destroy and no torpedo could replace. The men who abandoned her never knew how completely their world had changed in the moments they spent in the cold water. The men who boarded her never knew how many future patrols would be turned aside because of what they carried away. And the people who worked in the wooden huts with the captured materials never knew the faces of the sailors whose lives they were quietly protecting. The war at sea continued with its noise and its violence, but alongside it ran this other war, silent, invisible, and perhaps more decisive than any pack could have imagined. The aces still hunted. The convoys still sailed. But the sea itself had become a little less blind, and the packs that had once moved with such deadly freedom were already, without knowing it, beginning to move inside a net they could not see. The lights along the American coast burned bright against the winter dark, guiding the hunters straight to their prey, and for a time the war at sea felt less like a distant struggle and more like a spectacle that ordinary people could watch from their own beaches. The news of Pearl Harbor had reached the men in the French bases like a sudden change in the weather. They had been fighting a long, grinding campaign in the Atlantic, measuring their successes in convoys found and ships sent to the bottom, always aware that the enemy was learning and that the packs could not remain unchallenged forever. Now a new ocean had opened. The United States was in the war, and with that entry came an opportunity that their commander had been waiting for. He understood that the American coast, for all its power and industry, was almost completely unprepared for what submarines could do close to shore. There were no convoys running along the seaboard. There were no blackouts in the coastal towns and cities. Ships still sailed with their lights on, their silhouettes sharp against the glow from the land. To men who had spent months learning to find targets in the vast darkness of the mid-Atlantic, this was almost beyond belief. Orders went out. Boats that had been hunting in the eastern Atlantic were redirected westward on the long transit that would take them to the waters off New York, Cape Hatteras, and Florida. The journey itself was a test of endurance. The crews lived in the cramped steel world they knew too well, listening to the engines, taking turns on watch, writing letters in their heads that they might one day be able to send. Some of them had never crossed the Atlantic before. They talked quietly among themselves about what they might find, whether the stories of easy targets were true or whether the Americans would be ready and waiting. When the first boats arrived off the coast, the reality exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. One commander brought his boat to periscope depth in the early evening and saw, through the lens, the unmistakable outline of a large tanker moving steadily along the shore, fully lit, with the glow of cities visible behind it. He watched for a long time, almost unable to accept what he was seeing. The ship was not zigzagging. It was not part of any protective formation. It was simply sailing, as if the war had not yet reached these waters. He gave the order to surface and close in. The attack, when it came, was almost clinical in its simplicity. The torpedo ran true. The tanker erupted in flame that lit up the night sky for miles. From the bridge of the submarine the crew could see the fire spreading, could see small figures moving on the decks, could hear, or imagined they could hear, the distant sounds of alarm. They did not linger. They slipped back into the darkness and moved on, already searching for the next silhouette against the lights. On shore, people who had come to the beaches for an evening walk or who lived in houses facing the sea stopped what they were doing and stared. At first some of them thought it was a drill or movie being filmed. The explosions were bright and sudden, the columns of smoke visible even in the dark. Then the reality began to sink in. This was not practice. This was war, and it was happening within sight of American soil. Oil from the stricken tankers began washing up on the beaches in thick, greasy slicks. Bodies were recovered by Coast Guard boats and by fishermen who had gone out to help. The survivors who were brought ashore told stories of sudden violence in the night, the shock of the torpedo hit, the scramble to abandon ship, the struggle to stay afloat in water that was cold even in the southern latitudes, the way the burning oil had turned the sea into a nightmare of light and heat. Some of them had been merchant seamen who had already survived attacks in the Atlantic. They had thought they were coming home to safer waters. Instead, they found that the war had followed them all the way to their own coastline. The U-boat crews who operated in these waters lived inside a strange contradiction. On one hand, the hunting was easier than anything they had known. Ships sailed independently, often without escort, their courses predictable, their lights betraying them from miles away. A single boat could sometimes sink several vessels in a single night. The men felt the surge of success that comes when preparation meets opportunity. They wrote letters home describing the abundance of targets and the sense that they were finally striking back in a way that mattered. Yet the very ease of it created its own kind of unease. From the periscope or from the bridge on the surface, they could see the coast clearly, the houses, the cars moving along the roads, the ordinary life continuing while they brought death to ships just beyond the breakers. Some of the younger crew members found themselves staring at those lights long after an attack, trying to imagine the families inside those houses and what they must be feeling as they watched the fires. One rating, after his boat had sunk a tanker within sight of a popular beach, sat in the control room and could not stop thinking about the way the flames had reflected on the water. He had joined the service because he believed in protecting his country. Now he was bringing destruction to another country's shore, and the distance between those two ideas felt narrower than he had expected. The Americans who lived along that coast adapted with a mixture of anger, ingenuity, and the particular resilience that comes when war arrives on your doorstep. In some towns, the authorities finally imposed blackouts, though it took time and there was resistance from people who did not want to live in darkness. Fishermen and pleasure boat owners went out in their own vessels to search for survivors, often at great personal risk. Coast Guard stations worked around the clock. There were stories of ordinary citizens who pulled exhausted men from the surf or who gave up their own blankets and food without being asked. One woman who ran a small diner near the shore kept a pot of coffee going for days, feeding survivors and rescue workers alike, listening to their stories without asking too many questions. She later said that the worst part was not the explosions or the smoke but the quiet that came afterward, when the fires had burned out and all that remained was the oil on the water and the knowledge that men had died within sight of her windows. For the merchant sailors caught in these attacks, the experience was brutal and immediate. Tankers, carrying volatile cargoes, often exploded with devastating force. Men who had been on watch or asleep in their bunks had seconds to react. Some managed to launch lifeboats. Others jumped into the sea and swam away from the burning oil that spread across the surface. The cold water sapped strength quickly. The smoke and fumes made breathing difficult. Those who survived often spoke of the small decisions that had saved them, a shipmate who had insisted they wear their life jackets even on a short coastal run, a quick-thinking engineer who had shut down valves before abandoning ship, the way a group of strangers in a lifeboat had shared what little they had and kept each other awake through the long night. These were not dramatic acts of heroism in the storybook sense. They were the everyday courage of men who had already learned that survival at sea depended on looking after one another when everything else was falling apart. The U-boat commanders who led these operations understood that the window of easy success would not remain open indefinitely. They pushed their boats and their crews hard while the advantage lasted. Some of them felt a professional satisfaction in demonstrating how vulnerable even a powerful nation could be when it failed to take basic precautions. Others carried a quieter awareness that the very visibility of their successes, the fires seen from shore, the oil on the beaches, the bodies recovered in tourist towns, was creating a determination in the American people that would eventually make the coast far more dangerous for submarines. They were right. Within months, the United States had begun organizing coastal convoys, imposing stricter blackouts, and deploying more escorts and aircraft. The easy targets grew fewer. The packs that had operated with such freedom began to face the same kind of coordinated resistance they had encountered farther east. Yet for a time the coast had burned, and the memory of those nights stayed with everyone who had seen them. A young American boy who had been walking on the beach with his father on the night a tanker exploded would remember for the rest of his life the way the sky had turned orange and the way his father had gripped his hand too tightly and said nothing. A German crew member who had watched the same fire through his periscope would carry, in a different way, the image of that light reflecting on the water and the knowledge that war, when it comes close enough, loses some of its abstraction. The letters that traveled between the two sides, the ones that could be sent and the ones that could not, carried fragments of these experiences. A survivor might write to his family about the cold and the oil and the way strangers had pulled him from the water. A U-boat man might write home about the abundance of targets and the strange feeling of operating so close to land. Neither letter could fully capture what it had been like to stand on opposite sides of the same stretch of water and watch the same fire. The operation that had begun with such sudden and devastating effect gradually changed character as both sides adapted. The U-boats continued to find targets, but the cost in boats and men began to rise. The Americans learned hard lessons about what it meant to have war on their own shoreline. The packs that had once moved with relative freedom off the coast found themselves increasingly hunted in turn. Yet the human reality of those early months remained. Men on both sides had faced the same sea, the same cold, the same sudden violence, and had responded with the same mixture of fear, courage, and the small, stubborn kindnesses that keep people alive when everything else is trying to kill them. The lights on the shore had guided the hunters for a time. Eventually those lights were dimmed, the convoys were organized, and the coast became a harder place to hunt. But the memory of the nights when the drums had beaten so close to home stayed with the men who had lived through them, on the beaches, in the lifeboats, and inside the steel hulls that slipped away into the dark after doing what they had been sent to do. If the courage of sailors on both sides of the Atlantic, the men who faced sudden fire and cold water off their own shores and the crews who carried out orders in waters they had never expected to see, has reminded you how much these stories of sacrifice still matter, then you may want to hold a piece of that history yourself. Dedicated World War II enthusiasts can discover authentic naval memorabilia, carefully chosen books about the men who served at sea, and powerful films like Midway on Prime Video that honor the courage and sacrifice of sailors across every theater of the war. These are tangible ways to keep the memory of that shared humanity alive. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The coast had been a place of easy victories for a time, but it had also been a place where the human cost of war became impossible to ignore. The Packs had shown what they could do when the enemy was unprepared. The Americans had shown what they could endure and how quickly they could learn when the fires were visible from their own windows. The sea between them remained the same cold, vast arena it had always been. Only the men who sailed upon it had changed, some hardened by what they had seen, others steadied by the small acts of care that had kept them alive, all of them carrying forward the knowledge that war, once it reaches your own shore, never again feels entirely distant. The drums had beaten loud and close. The echo of that rhythm would continue long after the lights had been dimmed and the convoys had begun to move in ordered lines once more. The night the convoy scattered, the sea itself seemed to turn against the men who had trusted it to carry them safely across. What had begun as an ordered procession of ships became a chaos of burning wrecks, desperate lifeboats, and the sudden, invisible strikes of an enemy that had learned to hunt together. The slow convoy had left Canadian waters carrying the kind of cargo that kept Britain alive: grain, timber, steel, and the 1,000 small necessities of a nation at war. The ships were mostly old and slow, many of them veterans of earlier voyages that had already tested their hulls and their crews. The men who sailed them came from different nations and different lives. Some were hardened merchant seamen who had crossed the Atlantic so many times they no longer counted the voyages. Others were younger, still carrying the excitement of their first long trip mixed with the private fear that came with knowing the ocean had become a battlefield. On one ship, a captain who had served in the previous war walked the bridge and thought about how different this crossing felt. The weather was poor, the formation loose, and the escort, a handful of small warships, stretched thin across too many miles of vulnerable hulls. He had written to his wife before sailing, a short letter that said only that the cargo was important and that he would be home when the job was done. He did not mention the dreams that had woken him in the nights before departure, dreams of fire on the water and voices calling from the dark. Farther out in the same ocean, the submarines that would become the Pack were already moving. Their commanders had received word of the convoy's approximate position and course. They did not need to see one another to know what was expected. One boat made contact first, shadowing from a distance, reporting what it saw. Others adjusted their courses, closing in from different angles through the night. Inside the hulls, the crews went about their work with the quiet focus that came from having done this before. A young torpedo man checked his settings one more time, thinking of the letter he had received at the base from his sister, full of ordinary news from home that had felt impossibly distant. A petty officer moved among the men, speaking in low tones, steadying anyone whose hands betrayed the tension. The commander on the bridge watched the dark water and the distant shapes of the merchant ships, calculating angles and distances with the same care he might have used to plan a difficult approach in training. He knew that tonight would be different. Tonight the boats would not strike alone. The first torpedo hit without warning. On the merchant ship, the explosion was a sudden, violent interruption of ordinary routine, men thrown from bunks, alarms ringing, the deck tilting as water rushed in. The captain gave orders to abandon ship even as he tried to keep the vessel from sinking too quickly, hoping to give his crew time. Lifeboats were lowered into the cold, rough sea. Some men jumped. Others stayed to help the injured or to make sure the boats got away. In the water, the oil from ruptured tanks began to spread, and the cold quickly numbed hands and feet. A young sailor found himself in a lifeboat with strangers from his own ship and from another that had already been hit. They pulled an older man from the water who had been clinging to a piece of wreckage, his face gray with shock and exhaustion. Someone wrapped him in a spare coat. No one spoke much. The sound of more explosions rolled across the water from other parts of the convoy, and the men in the boat knew that whatever safety they had once felt in numbers was gone. On the attacking submarines, the crews felt a mix of exhilaration and something harder to name. The first hits confirmed that the coordination was working. One boat fired and slipped away while another moved in from a different bearing. The escorts, few and already stretched, raced toward the sound of the explosions, dropping depth charges that shook the sea but could not be everywhere at once. A U-boat commander watched through his periscope as another ship began to burn, the flames lighting up the night in a way that made the water around it look almost beautiful and utterly wrong. He gave the order to fire again, then took the boat deep to avoid the counterattack he knew would come. In the control room, the men waited in the sudden silence, listening to the distant charges and to the sound of their own breathing. One of them thought about a conversation he had had with his commander weeks earlier, about how the pack was meant to overwhelm the defenses by striking from several directions at once. The theory had sounded clean in the base. In the water, it was something else entirely, fire and screams carried on the wind, and the knowledge that every successful attack also meant men fighting for their lives in the cold. The night stretched on with attack after attack. Ships that had been sailing in loose formation were now isolated or already sinking. Some captains tried to keep their vessels moving toward the imagined safety of the escort screen. Others gave the order to stop and abandon when it became clear the ship could not be saved. In one lifeboat, a group of survivors from 3 different ships found themselves together. They shared what little they had, a flask of water, a few biscuits someone had grabbed before leaving, and took turns watching the horizon for any sign of rescue. A man who had been a cook on his ship told a quiet story about his daughter's wedding, the kind of ordinary memory that suddenly felt like the most important thing in the world. Another man, a stoker, said nothing for a long time and then quietly thanked the others for pulling him aboard. In the darkness, their small acts of care became the only thing that kept panic from taking hold. On the submarines, the success was real and undeniable. The pack had found the convoy, concentrated its strength, and struck again and again while the escorts struggled to respond. Yet even in the moment of triumph, there were moments that stayed with the men who had fired the torpedoes. One commander surfaced briefly after an attack and saw, in the light of a burning ship, the shapes of lifeboats and men in the water. He did not linger. He took his boat away, already thinking about the next approach, but the image remained. Later, when the boat was safely deep and running silent, he sat in his small cabin and wrote a few lines in the log that had nothing to do with tonnage or positions. He wrote about the sea that night and about the way fire on water changes everything it touches. He did not send the words anywhere. They were for himself, a private acknowledgement that even when the pack worked perfectly, the cost was measured in more than ships. Rescue came slowly for those in the water. The escorts could not be everywhere, and the weather made searching difficult. Some lifeboats were found by other merchant ships that had survived the initial attacks. Others drifted for hours or days before being spotted. The men who were pulled aboard carried the physical cold and the deeper shock of having seen their ships and their shipmates taken so quickly. A captain who had lost his vessel sat on the deck of a rescue ship and stared at nothing for a long time before he began to speak quietly about the men who had not made it into the boats. He would write letters to their families when he reached port, he said. It was the least he could do. On one of the surviving ships, a young ordinary seaman who had helped launch the lifeboats and then stayed to fight a fire found himself unable to sleep even after the immediate danger had passed. He kept seeing the face of an older shipmate who had pushed him toward a boat and then turned back for someone else. The image would stay with him for years, surfacing in quiet moments when he least expected it. The pack that had attacked the convoy returned to base with the satisfaction of a job well done. The coordination had worked. Multiple boats had struck the same target group from different directions, overwhelming the limited defenses and achieving results that no single submarine could have managed alone. The commanders compared notes in the way professionals do after a difficult operation. There was pride in what they had accomplished together. There was also the knowledge that the enemy would learn from this night and that the next convoy might not be so vulnerable. In the mess halls the crews ate and talked and tried to rest, but the images from the attacks lingered for some of them. A torpedo man who had fired during the height of the action found himself thinking about the lifeboats he had seen in the water. He did not speak of it. He simply folded the thought away with the other things that could not be changed and prepared for whatever the next patrol would bring. For the men who had been on the receiving end, the memory of that night became part of the larger story of the war at sea. They spoke of it in quiet conversations years later, or they carried it in silence, the way people carry the things that have marked them. The slow convoy had been meant to deliver supplies that mattered. Instead, it had become a demonstration of what coordinated submarine attack could do when the defenses were thin and the formation was loose. The packs had found their first great triumph, and the sea had shown once again that it had no mercy for those who traveled upon it in times of war. The men on both sides, the ones who had fired the torpedoes and the ones who had fought to keep their ships afloat, had lived through the same hours of fire and water and darkness. What they took away from those hours was different, but the sea itself remained unchanged, vast and cold and waiting for whoever would next trust their lives to its surface. The raw reality of nights like this one, the burning ships, the men struggling in the oil and the cold, the sudden collapse of order into chaos, is captured in photographs and footage that are often too visceral and heartbreaking to show openly. Our special Gumroad collection holds raw, uncensored images and rare material from the U-boat campaign that reveal the true face of submarine warfare in ways words alone cannot convey. If you want to see the unfiltered human cost that shaped these stories, this is where you can find it. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The pack had proven what it could do when its boats worked together. The convoy had shown what happened when men in slow, scattered ships met an enemy that had learned to strike from every direction at once. Between those two truths lay the long, brutal education that would define the years ahead, the slow realization on one side that better protection and better tactics were needed, and on the other the understanding that even the most successful nights carried a cost that could not be measured only in ships sunk. The men who had lived through that particular darkness carried its lessons forward in different ways. Some would sail again on other convoys, steadied by the knowledge that survival sometimes depended on the stranger in the next lifeboat. Others would take their boats out again, knowing that the sea that had given them victory one night could just as easily take everything the next. The killing ground had been the convoy itself, and the sea had been both witness and accomplice. What remained, after the fires had burned out and the lifeboats had been found or lost, was the quiet, stubborn fact that ordinary men on both sides had done what the moment demanded of them, and that the war, like the ocean, would continue long after any single night of fire and loss had ended. In a quiet country estate far from the sea, men and women worked through the night in wooden huts that smelled of damp wood, cigarette smoke, and the sharp tang of overheated machinery, fighting a battle no one outside those rooms could ever acknowledge, and on which the lives of thousands of sailors depended every single day. The people who arrived at Bletchley Park came from many different lives. Some were mathematicians who had spent years chasing patterns in numbers that seemed to have no pattern at all. Others were linguists who loved languages and puzzles, or clerks and secretaries who had simply answered a call for people who could keep secrets and work long hours without complaint. Many of the women were from the Wrens, the Women's Royal Naval Service, young and often far from home for the first time. They had been told only that the work was important and that they must never speak of it to anyone, not even to the people they loved most. When they first walked through the gates of the old manor house and saw the clusters of wooden huts scattered across the grounds, some of them felt a strange mixture of excitement and unease. The place looked ordinary enough from the outside: trees, lawns, a big house that might have belonged to any wealthy family before the war. But inside the huts the air was thick with concentration, and the sound of machines clattering never quite stopped. One young mathematician had been recruited because someone had noticed his talent for solving problems that others found impossible. He arrived with a small suitcase and a head full of questions he could not ask. On his first day he was shown to a hut where rows of people sat at tables covered in papers covered in letters that made no sense. He was given a pile of intercepted messages and told to look for anything that might repeat or give a clue. At first the work felt endless and pointless. The letters swam in front of his eyes after hours of staring. His back ached from the hard chairs, and the hut was always too cold in winter and too warm in summer. But slowly he began to see the shape of the problem. The enemy's messages were protected by a machine that changed its settings every day, yet the people who used the machine were still human. They made small mistakes. They repeated phrases. They sent weather reports or position reports that followed predictable patterns. Those tiny human weaknesses became the cracks through which the codebreakers could begin to see inside the system. The women who operated the great machines that helped test possible settings worked in shifts that seemed to have no beginning or end. The machines were loud, and the work required absolute precision. A single mistake in setting up the connections could waste hours. Yet in the middle of the noise and the pressure there were small moments of care. One Wren noticed that a colleague had been shivering through a long night shift and quietly brought her a spare sweater she had brought from home. Another time, when a young woman broke down after a particularly frustrating stretch with no results, an older colleague sat with her in the small canteen and simply listened while she talked about missing her family and feeling as though nothing she did mattered. The older woman did not say much. She simply said that the work did matter, even when it felt invisible, and that sometimes the most important victories were the ones no one ever heard about. The younger woman went back to her machine steadier, and the next day a small breakthrough came that helped unlock a whole series of messages. The pressure was constant and invisible. The codebreakers knew that every message they broke could mean the difference between a convoy reaching Britain safely or being scattered and sunk by submarines waiting in the dark. They also knew that if the enemy ever suspected how much was being read, the advantage would disappear overnight. So they lived inside a double silence. They could not tell their families what they did. They could not celebrate their successes openly. When a particularly important convoy was saved because of something they had found, they heard about it only in the most guarded terms, a brief note passed from one hut to another, or a quiet word from someone higher up. The joy of a breakthrough was real, but it was always mixed with the knowledge that they could never share it with the people who mattered most to them. One linguist who worked on the naval messages had a brother serving in the merchant navy. She had not heard from him in weeks, and every time a new batch of intercepted traffic came and she felt the same quiet fear. She worked longer hours than most, driven by the hope that something she found might help keep ships like her brother's out of danger. Late one night, after a long stretch with no progress, she found a small repeated phrase in a message that had been sent several days earlier. It was the kind of tiny detail that might mean nothing, or everything. She took it to a colleague, and together they worked through the night, testing possibilities until the message began to open. What they found was a warning about U-boat positions in the path of several convoys. The information was passed upward in the careful, anonymous way all such intelligence moved. Days later, word came back that the convoys had been rerouted and had passed safely. The linguist never knew exactly which ships had been saved, but she allowed herself to hope that one of them might have carried her brother. She wrote a short letter home that night, saying only that she was well and that she hoped he was too. She could not say more, but the act of writing the words felt like a small connection across the silence that surrounded her work. The men and women at Bletchley lived with the constant knowledge that their mistakes could cost lives just as surely as any torpedo. When a setting was missed or a message was not broken in time, the consequences arrived in the form of reports about ships lost or attacks that could not be prevented. Those failures sat heavily on the people who had worked on them. There were nights when the huts felt heavier than usual, when the machines seemed louder and the air harder to breathe. In those moments, the small kindnesses mattered more than ever. Someone would bring extra tea. Someone else would quietly take over a difficult task so a colleague could step outside for a few minutes of cold night air. These gestures were never dramatic, but they kept people going when the weight of the secret war threatened to become too much. The impact of their work reached far beyond the huts. Out on the Atlantic, convoys that should have been found by waiting packs sometimes passed through waters that were suddenly empty. U-boat commanders who had expected easy targets found only open sea and the frustration of missed opportunities. They could not know why their carefully positioned groups were coming up empty. They blamed the weather, or bad luck, or improved enemy tactics. They did not know that far away, in a place they had never heard of, people they would never meet were reading their orders almost as soon as they were written. The codebreakers, for their part, lived with the opposite frustration. They could see the danger forming, but they could never explain how they knew. They had to watch the information they had worked so hard to obtain being used in ways that protected lives without ever revealing the source. It was a strange kind of heroism, one that required them to stay invisible even when they most wanted to speak. There were moments of quiet triumph that stayed with the people who experienced them. One morning, after a particularly difficult night, a group of codebreakers gathered in one of the huts around a table covered in the results of their work. They had broken a series of messages that revealed the positions and intentions of several U-boats operating against a large convoy. The information had already been passed on, and word had come back that the convoy had changed course and avoided the trap. No one cheered. The victory was too serious for that. But for a few minutes they allowed themselves to feel the weight of what they had done lift slightly. Someone made tea. Someone else passed around a packet of biscuits that had been saved for a special occasion. They did not talk about the messages or the lives that had been protected. They simply sat together in the early light and shared the ordinary comfort of being in the same room with people who understood the cost of the silence they all kept. The work never stopped. New messages arrived constantly. New problems appeared as the enemy changed procedures or introduced new machines. The people at Bletchley adapted, learned, and kept going because they understood that the alternative was unthinkable. They carried the burden of secrecy because they believed the lives saved were worth the personal cost. They found strength in one another, in the shared understanding that no one outside could fully grasp what they were doing, and in the small, daily acts of care that reminded them they were still human even when their work required them to live like ghosts. If the quiet courage of these men and women, the ones who worked in the shadows so that others could sail in greater safety, has moved you, and if you want to help keep their stories and the stories of all the forgotten voices from this war alive, then there is a simple way to make a real difference. You can leave a small tip, even just $1, on Ko-Fi to help sustain the countless hours of research, survivor interviews, and careful storytelling required to bring these hidden chapters back into the light. It truly helps. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The Shadow War fought at Bletchley Park was never separate from the war fought on the surface of the Atlantic. The two struggles were connected by every message that crossed the sea and by every life that was saved or lost because of what was known or unknown. The men and women in the huts could not sail the ships or fire the torpedoes, but they fought with the only weapons they had: patience, intelligence, and the stubborn refusal to accept that the enemy's secrets were beyond reach. Their victories were measured not in ships sunk or tonnage destroyed, but in convoys that arrived safely, and families that never received the telegrams they might otherwise have received, and in the quiet knowledge that somewhere, because of something they had found in the middle of the night, a young sailor might make it home. They lived inside a silence that protected the very thing they were trying to defend. And long after the war ended, long after the huts were emptied and the machines were silent, the memory of what they had done remained with those who had been there. A reminder that some of the most important battles are fought by people the world never sees and never thanks, and that courage can take the form of sitting at a table covered in letters that make no sense until, slowly and patiently, they begin to speak. The sea that had once hidden the wolves so well was beginning to betray them, as new eyes and ears turned the hunters into the hunted in ways they had never imagined. The change did not arrive all at once. It came in small, unsettling moments that the men inside the submarines noticed first. A boat that had been running on the surface at night, recharging batteries and searching for the next convoy, would suddenly hear the urgent warning from the lookout or the radar detector. An aircraft approaching fast from a direction where none should have been. The boat would crash dive, sometimes with only seconds to spare, and then lie deep while the depth charges rolled overhead. The men in the control room would count the patterns, feeling the hull shudder and the lights flicker, and they would wonder how the enemy had found them so quickly in the dark. On other nights, a U-boat commander would be preparing to close in on a convoy when the radio operator reported a sudden, accurate burst of gunfire or the arrival of escorts that seemed to know exactly where to look. The old confidence that had carried the packs through the earlier months began to crack. The sea no longer felt like their private hunting ground. On the other side of that same sea, the men on the escorts were learning a new kind of war. They had spent months defending convoys against attackers who appeared without warning and vanished again before anyone could strike back. Now they were being given tools that let them turn the chase around. On one destroyer, a young radar operator sat hunched over his screen during a long night watch, watching the green glow for any tiny blip that did not belong. The equipment was new and temperamental, but when it worked it could detect the low silhouette of a submarine on the surface even when human lookouts saw nothing. On this particular night the blip appeared suddenly, steady and clear. The operator called the bridge, his voice tight with the mixture of excitement and fear that came with knowing he had found something real. The ship altered course. Other escorts in the group moved with it. Within minutes the submarine was forced to dive, and the depth charge patterns began. The men on the destroyer did not see the boat go down, but they felt the change in the water when the charges found their mark. Later, when the convoy had passed safely, the radar operator sat in a mess with a cup of tea that had gone cold and tried to write a letter home. He could not describe what he had done. He could only say that the night had been long and that he hoped the people he loved were safe. The high-frequency direction finders, the sets the sailors called Huffduff, added another layer to the hunt. When a U-boat surfaced to report a sighting or to coordinate with other boats in the pack, it had to transmit. Those transmissions, no matter how brief, could be picked up by receivers on the escorts and on shore stations. The bearings from several receivers could be plotted on a chart, and the position of the transmitting submarine could be fixed with surprising accuracy. On one escort group, the officer responsible for the Huff-Duff set worked in a small, cramped compartment filled with the hum of equipment and the constant scratch of pencil on paper. He had learned to recognize the rhythm of a U-boat's signals, the short, urgent bursts that meant a contact had been made. When he plotted a fix that placed a submarine only a few miles ahead of the convoy, he felt the same quiet satisfaction that came with solving a difficult puzzle. The information went to the bridge. The group commander altered the convoy's course slightly and sent 2 escorts ahead to investigate. The U-boat, still on the surface and unaware that its brief transmission had betrayed it, was surprised by the sudden appearance of the hunters. It dived, but the escorts stayed with the contact, working the area with depth charges and sonar until the sea went quiet. The men on the escorts did not celebrate loudly. They knew that somewhere beneath them other men were fighting for their lives. But they also knew that every submarine kept from attacking the convoy meant hundreds of merchant seamen who would reach port safely. The arrival of escort carriers changed the equation even more. These small, hastily converted ships could carry a handful of aircraft and operate in the mid-Atlantic where land-based planes could not reach. For the first time, convoys had their own air cover that could search ahead and to the flanks, forcing U-boats to stay submerged or risk sudden attack. On one such carrier, a young pilot prepared for a night patrol in an aircraft fitted with a powerful searchlight. The lee light, as it was called, could be switched on at the last moment to illuminate a surfaced submarine caught in the beam. The pilot had trained for this, but nothing prepared him for the reality of flying low over the dark sea, watching the radar screen, and then suddenly seeing the gray shape of a U-boat caught in the blinding light. He pressed the attack, watching the tracers from his gun stitch across the water and the deck of the submarine. The boat began to dive, but the damage was already done. Later, back on the carrier, the pilot sat in the ready room with the other aircrew and tried to steady his hands. One of his squadron mates passed him a cigarette without a word. They did not talk much about the attack. They simply shared the silence of men who had done what was asked of them and who knew that tomorrow they would have to do it again. The hunter-killer groups took the offensive even further. Instead of staying tied to a single convoy, these groups roamed the ocean in search of U-boats wherever they could be found. One of the most effective was led by a commander who believed that the best defense was relentless attack. His ships worked together with a discipline that came from long practice and from the knowledge that every contact had to be pursued until it was destroyed or driven off. On one such operation, the group picked up a strong signal from a U-boat that had been shadowing a convoy. Instead of simply driving it away, the commander ordered his ships to stay with the contact through the night and into the next day. The U-boat dived and tried every trick its commander knew, changing depth, turning sharply, releasing decoys, but the escorts kept the pressure on. Depth charges rolled in patterns that grew tighter and more accurate as the hours passed. Inside the submarine, the air grew thick and foul. The men lay on their bunks or sat in the control room, listening to the explosions that seemed to come from every direction at once. A young rating who had joined only a few months earlier found himself gripping the edge of his bunk so hard his knuckles turned white. An older petty officer sitting nearby reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder, not speaking, just letting him know he was not alone. The attack went on for hours. When it finally ended, the sea above was quiet, but the boat was damaged and the men inside were exhausted in body and spirit. The psychological shift was as important as any piece of equipment. The U-boat crews who had once felt like the wolves of the Atlantic now lived with the constant sense that they were being watched. Every time they surfaced to recharge batteries or to transmit, they risked detection. Every time they approached a convoy, they had to weigh the chance of success against the growing likelihood of a swift and accurate counterattack. Some commanders adapted by spending more time submerged, accepting the slower speed and the strain on the crew. Others pushed on with the old tactics and paid the price. On one boat that had survived a particularly heavy attack, the commander gathered his men in the control room after they had surfaced again. He spoke quietly about the new reality they faced. The enemy had learned, he said. The sea was no longer theirs alone. They would have to be smarter, more careful, and more willing to accept that some attacks could not be pressed home. The men listened in silence. They had already seen too many boats fail to return. They knew the commander was right, but knowing did not make the fear any smaller. On the escort side, the men who were learning these new tactics carried their own burdens. They saw the human cost of their successes when oil and debris rose to the surface after a successful depth charge attack. Some of them had friends or brothers who had been lost to submarines earlier in the war, and the knowledge that they were now the ones delivering that same fate brought a complicated mix of satisfaction and sorrow. One young officer on a destroyer wrote a letter to his wife after his ship had helped sink a U-boat. He described the long hunt and the final pattern of charges that had ended it. He did not describe the moment when the sea had gone still and the realization had settled that other men had died in the boat beneath them. Instead, he wrote about how the convoy had passed safely and how he hoped the war would end soon so he could come home. He folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others he had written but not yet been able to post. The small act of writing the words felt like a way of holding onto something human in the middle of a war that often felt anything but. The technology and the tactics continued to evolve. More escort carriers joined the fight. More aircraft were fitted with better radar and better lights. The hunter-killer groups grew more skilled at working together and at reading the signs the sea gave them. The U-boat crews responded with their own adaptations, staying deeper, using new listening devices, accepting longer periods submerged even when it meant slower progress and greater discomfort. The balance was shifting, but the fight was far from over. Both sides were learning that the Atlantic was large enough to hide many secrets and small enough that no advantage lasted forever. The men on both sides of this changing war carried the weight of it in different ways. Some wrote letters that tried to sound braver than they felt. Others found strength in the small kindnesses that passed between shipmates during long watches or after difficult attacks, a shared cigarette, a quiet word of encouragement, a hand on the shoulder when words were not enough. These moments did not change the outcome of any single battle, but they kept people going when the sea and the enemy seemed determined to break them. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and the hunted were learning to fight back with tools that had once seemed like science fiction. The sea remained the same cold, vast arena it had always been. Only the men who sailed upon it were changing, day by day and night by night, as the war taught them new lessons about fear, resilience, and the price of staying alive when everything around them was trying to kill them. If the personal stories of innovation under pressure, the quiet courage of men on both sides learning to survive a changing war, and the small human moments that held crews together have stayed with you, then our Patreon community is the perfect place to go deeper. History lovers there gain access to uncensored deep dive podcasts, raw video segments without blurring, exclusive collections of survivor letters, and a warm circle of fellow enthusiasts who refuse to let these stories fade. It is a place where the full weight of what these men lived through can be explored together with others who feel the same pull. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The balance in the Atlantic was tipping, but the tipping was measured in the lived experience of ordinary men who had never expected to become experts in radar or direction finding or the grim arithmetic of depth charge patterns. The U-boat crews who had once moved with such deadly freedom now moved with caution, always listening for the warning that would send them deep. The escort crews who had once felt only the frustration of defense now felt the growing power of the tools in their hands. Both sides understood that the war at sea was entering a new phase, one in which technology and tactics would matter as much as courage and endurance. The sea itself remained indifferent. It simply waited to see which men would learn its newest lessons fastest and which would pay the price for learning them too slowly. The hunters had become the hunted, but the hunted were not yet defeated. They were only beginning to understand how much the rules had changed. The stormy waters of the North Atlantic had become a place where entire convoys could vanish into chaos in a single night, and the men who sailed into that chaos carried with them the fragile hope that their ships and their shipmates might somehow make it through. Two great convoys were moving eastward in those March days, one faster and more heavily laden with war materials, the other slower and more vulnerable, both carrying the lifeblood of a nation still fighting for its survival. The men aboard the merchant ships had grown used to the routines of convoy life, the zigzagging courses, the dimmed lights, the constant watch for anything that might break the surface. Yet even the most experienced among them felt the weight of what lay ahead. On one of the faster ships, a young ordinary seaman wrote a short letter to his sister before the convoy formed up. He told her about the cargo they carried and about how the captain had said this crossing would be no different from the others. He did not write about the dreams that had woken him in the nights before sailing, dreams of fire on the water and voices calling from the dark. He folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket, telling himself he would post it when they reached the other side. Farther out in the same ocean, the submarines that would form the attacking packs were already moving into position. Their commanders had received orders to concentrate on the approaching convoys. The boats came from several groups, each one slipping through the water with the quiet discipline that had become second nature. Inside the hulls, the crews went about their preparations without much talk. A torpedo man checked his settings one more time, thinking of the small photograph of his wife he kept tucked inside his jacket. An officer on the bridge watched the dark horizon and felt the familiar mix of anticipation and dread that came before any hunt. They knew this would be no ordinary attack. The orders spoke of multiple boats working together against the same targets, striking from different directions so that the escorts could not be everywhere at once. The weather turned against the convoys almost as soon as they entered the dangerous waters. Storms scattered the ships, opening gaps in the protective screen and making it harder for the escorts to maintain contact with every vessel. On the slower convoy, the older ships labored through heavy seas, their crews fighting to keep station while the wind and waves did their best to pull everything apart. A captain on one of those ships stood on his bridge and watched the dim shapes of his neighbors disappear into the rain and spray. He had been through attacks before, but never with the formation so broken and the escorts so stretched. He gave orders to keep the ship moving and the lookouts sharp, but he could not shake the feeling that they were already more alone than they should have been. The first contacts came in the darkness. A U-boat on the edge of one of the packs sighted the scattered ships and reported what it saw. Other boats adjusted their courses, closing in through the storm. The coordination happened in short, careful radio messages that the men on the submarines knew could betray them if they lingered too long. On one boat, the commander gave the order to surface and begin the approach. The sea was rough, the visibility poor, but the targets were there, dark shapes against the slightly lighter sky, moving without the tight discipline that might have kept them safer. The first torpedo was fired from close range. On the merchant ship, the explosion was sudden and violent, a roar that threw men from their bunks and sent alarms ringing through the passageways. The captain on the bridge felt the deck lurch beneath him and knew immediately that his ship was badly hurt. He gave the order to abandon while there was still time, then stayed to make sure the lifeboats got away. Around him, other ships were already burning or beginning to list. The night had turned into a chaos of fire and shouting and the sound of more torpedoes striking home. On the attacking submarines, the crews felt the surge of success that came when a carefully planned attack found its mark. One boat fired and slipped away while another moved in from a different angle. The escorts, caught between protecting the remaining ships and chasing the attackers, could not be everywhere. On one of the U-boats, a young crew member watched through the periscope as another merchant vessel erupted in flame. He had seen ships sink before, but never so many in such a short time. The scale of it left him strangely quiet. Later, when the boat was running deep to avoid the counterattack, he sat in his narrow bunk and thought about the men who had been on those decks. He did not speak of it to the others. He simply carried the image with him, another weight added to the ones he already carried from earlier patrols. The chaos on the merchant ships was total. Men who had been asleep or on watch found themselves struggling through smoke and darkness to reach the lifeboats or the open decks. On one vessel, a young sailor helped an older shipmate who had been injured by the blast. They moved together toward the rail, the older man leaning heavily on the younger one's shoulder. When they reached the water, the cold was immediate and shocking. They clung to wreckage and to each other, calling out for anyone who might still be nearby. In another lifeboat, a group of survivors from two different ships found themselves together. They shared what little they had, a flask of water, a few biscuits someone had grabbed before leaving, and took turns watching the horizon for any sign of rescue. One man, a stoker who had been on his first long voyage, quietly told the others about his home and his family. The others listened without interrupting. In the middle of the destruction, those small stories became a way of holding onto something human. The escorts fought back as best they could. On one of the destroyers, the commander made the difficult decision to leave part of the convoy to its fate in order to drive off a pack that was still attacking. Depth charges rolled into the water where the hydrophones had picked up a contact. The men on the ship felt a familiar shudder through the hull and waited to see if the sea would give them any sign that they had found their target. Sometimes it did. More often the only result was the continued sound of explosions from other parts of the convoy as more ships were hit. The frustration was real, but so was the determination. They had learned that even when the packs came in force, every boat they could drive off or damage meant fewer torpedoes aimed at the remaining merchantmen. For the men in the water, the night stretched into a long fight for survival. The oil from the ruptured tanks spread across the surface, making it harder to breathe and harder to stay afloat. Some lifeboats managed to stay together. Others were swamped or drifted apart in the storm. A group of survivors from one of the slower ships found themselves in a small boat with barely enough room for everyone. They took turns bailing and watching for any sign of rescue. One of them, a man who had served in the previous war, spoke quietly about how different this crossing had felt from the beginning. The others listened. There was nothing else to do but listen and wait and try to keep the fear from taking hold. On the submarines, the success was measured in the number of ships that had been sent to the bottom, but the men inside those boats also carried the knowledge of what that success had cost. They had seen the fires and the lifeboats. They had heard the distant sounds of men calling in the water. Some of the commanders ordered their boats to move on quickly after an attack, unwilling to linger where the human cost was so visible. Others took a moment to surface and look at what they had done before slipping away again. The pride in a well-executed pack attack was real, but it was always mixed with something harder to name: the understanding that every ship they sank carried men who had families waiting for them on the other side of the ocean. Rescue came slowly for those who had survived the initial attacks. Some lifeboats were found by other merchant ships that had managed to stay with the remnants of the convoy. Others were spotted by the escorts that had turned back to search once the main attack had passed. The men who were pulled aboard carried the physical cold and the deeper shock of having seen so many ships and so many shipmates taken in a single night. A captain who had lost his vessel sat on the deck of a rescue ship and stared at nothing for a long time before he began to speak quietly about the men who had not made it into the boats. He would write letters to their families when he reached port, he said. It was the least he could do. The packs that had attacked the two convoys achieved one of the largest successes of the campaign. Dozens of ships had been sunk, and the escorts had been overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers coming from different directions in the storm. Yet even in that moment of apparent victory, there were signs that the balance was beginning to shift. Some of the U-boats had been driven off or damaged by the escorts that refused to give up. Aircraft had appeared in greater numbers than before, forcing boats to dive and lose contact. The weather that had helped scatter the convoys had also made it harder for the packs to maintain perfect coordination. The men on both sides sensed that this kind of mass attack, while devastating, might not be sustainable forever. For the survivors, the memory of that night stayed with them long after they reached port. They spoke of it in quiet conversations or carried it in silence. The letters they wrote home tried to balance the truth of what had happened with the need not to frighten the people who were waiting. A young sailor who had spent hours in a lifeboat wrote to his mother that he was safe and that the sea had been rough, but that he was looking forward to coming home. He did not describe the fires or the cold or the way the older men in the boat had quietly made sure the younger ones had the best places. Those details he kept for himself, another layer added to the ones that had already changed him. The March attacks marked the high point of what the Wolfpacks could achieve when everything came together: large numbers of boats, scattered convoys, and weather that favored the attackers. But they also marked the beginning of the end of that kind of dominance. The Allies were learning, slowly and at terrible cost, how to fight back more effectively. The men who had lived through those nights on both sides carried the lessons forward in different ways. Some would sail again on other convoys, steadied by the knowledge that survival sometimes depended on the stranger in the next lifeboat. Others would take their submarines out again, knowing that the sea that had given them such success one night could just as easily turn against them the next. The convoys had been caught in a killing ground, but the killing ground was not permanent. The war at sea was entering its most brutal phase, and the men who sailed upon it were only beginning to understand how much more would be asked of them before it was over. If the hidden courage of the men who fought these massive convoy battles, the quiet resilience of survivors in lifeboats, the determination of escort crews who refused to give up, and the complex weight carried by the attackers themselves, has left you wanting to explore more of the secret operations and forgotten heroism that shaped this war, then I have something valuable to share with you. Our free email newsletter will bring you the exclusive ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, including the full hidden story of the Enigma captures, along with weekly dispatches that reveal the espionage, the courage, and the forgotten heroes who worked behind the headlines. It is the perfect way to keep these stories alive in your own inbox. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The 2 convoys had sailed into one of the largest and most concentrated attacks the Packs had yet mounted, and the sea had shown once again that it could turn entire formations into burning wreckage in the space of a few hours. The men who survived carried the memory of that night with them, the sound of torpedoes striking home, the sight of ships listing and sinking, the cold and the oil and the small, stubborn acts of care that kept some of them alive when everything else was trying to pull them under. The Packs had achieved a victory that would be remembered as one of their greatest, but even in that victory there were already hints that the tide was beginning to turn. The hunters had struck with devastating force, yet the hunted had not broken. They had endured, and in enduring they had begun to learn the lessons that would eventually change everything. The Atlantic remained vast and cold and unforgiving, but the men who sailed upon it were changing with every night of fire and loss, and the war they were fighting was entering a phase where no advantage, no matter how great, would last forever. The storm that swept across the North Atlantic in those late April days did not distinguish between hunter and hunted. It scattered ships and submarines alike, turning the ocean into a place where even the most carefully laid plans could be torn apart by wind and wave, and where the men caught in that chaos discovered what they were truly made of. The slow convoy had sailed from North American waters carrying the kind of cargo that kept the war effort alive on the other side of the ocean. The ships were older, many of them veterans of earlier crossings that had already tested their hulls and their crews. The men aboard came from different nations and different lives, but they shared the same quiet understanding that another long voyage through dangerous waters lay ahead. On one of the merchantmen, a young able seaman wrote a letter to his wife before the convoy formed up. He told her about the cargo they carried and about how the captain had promised this would be a routine crossing if the weather held. He did not mention the dreams that had woken him before dawn, dreams of torpedoes striking in the dark and voices calling from the water. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket, telling himself he would post it when they reached port. Farther out in the same storm-tossed sea, the submarines that would form the attacking pack were already moving into position. Their commanders had received orders to concentrate on the approaching convoy, and the boats slipped through the heavy weather with the discipline that had carried them through so many previous hunts. Inside the hulls the crews prepared without much talk. A torpedo man checked his settings one more time, thinking of the small photograph of his children he kept tucked inside his jacket. An officer on the bridge watched the mountainous waves and felt the familiar mix of anticipation and unease that came before any attack. They knew the weather would make coordination difficult, but they also knew that a scattered convoy could be even more vulnerable once the storm passed. The boats closed in from different directions, using the cover of rain and spray to mask their approach. The first contacts came amid the gale. A U-boat on the edge of the pack sighted the scattered ships through the driving rain and reported what it saw. Other boats adjusted their courses, fighting the sea to close the distance. On one of the merchant ships the lookout called out a warning, but the storm made it hard to be certain what he had seen. The captain on the bridge ordered an increase in speed and a change of course, but the heavy weather made every maneuver slow and uncertain. When the first torpedo struck, the explosion was almost lost in the roar of the waves. The ship shuddered and began to list. Men who had been asleep or on watch found themselves struggling through darkness and spray to reach the lifeboats. The captain stayed on the bridge long enough to make sure the boats were away, then joined the last of his crew in the water. Around them other ships were already burning or beginning to settle, their lights flickering against the storm. On the attacking submarines, the crews felt the surge of success that came when a carefully planned approach found its mark. One boat fired and slipped away while another moved in from a different bearing, using the storm to hide its movements. The escorts, few in number and already stretched thin by the weather, raced toward the sound of the explosions. On one of the escort vessels, the commander made the difficult decision to leave part of the scattered convoy to its fate in order to drive off the attackers that were still pressing in. Depth charges rolled into the water where the hydrophones had picked up a contact. The men on the escort felt the familiar shudder through the hull and waited to see if the sea would give them any sign that they had found their target. Sometimes it did. More often the only result was the continued sound of distant explosions as more ships were hit. Inside one of the U-boats the crew endured the counterattack with the grim patience that came from having survived similar hunts before. The boat was driven deep by the charges, and the men lay on their bunks or sat in the control room, listening to the explosions that seemed to come from every direction at once. A young rating who had joined only a few months earlier found himself gripping the edge of his bunk so hard his knuckles turned white. An older petty officer sitting nearby reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder, not speaking, just letting him know he was not alone. The attack went on for what felt like hours. When it finally eased, the boat surfaced cautiously into the storm. The commander looked out at the dark water and the distant lights of burning ships and felt the weight of what they had done settle over him. He gave the order to move on, already thinking about the next approach, but the image of the fire stayed with him. On the merchant ships that had not yet been hit, the crews fought to keep their vessels moving and the formation as tight as the storm would allow. A captain on one of the surviving ships stood on his bridge and watched the dim shapes of his neighbors disappear into the rain and spray. He had been through attacks before, but never with the weather this bad and the escorts so scattered. He gave orders to keep the ship zigzagging and the lookouts sharp, but he could not shake the feeling that they were already more alone than they should have been. When another torpedo struck a ship nearby, the explosion lit up the night for a moment, and he saw the dark shapes of lifeboats in the water. He ordered his own vessel to slow and lower boats to help, knowing that every minute they lingered increased their own risk. The men who went out in the rescue boats fought the waves and the cold to pull survivors from the water. On one such boat a young sailor helped an older man who had been clinging to wreckage. They pulled him aboard and wrapped him in a spare coat. The older man could barely speak, but he gripped the younger sailor's hand for a moment in silent thanks. Those small acts of care became the only thing that kept despair from taking hold. The storm that had helped the attackers by scattering the convoy also made it harder for the Wolfpack to maintain perfect coordination. Boats lost contact with one another in the heavy weather. Radio messages were delayed or missed. The escorts, though outnumbered, began to use the new tools they had been given with growing effectiveness. Radar sets picked up surfaced submarines even in the rain and darkness. Direction finders triangulated the brief transmissions the U-boats made when they tried to coordinate. Aircraft from distant bases appeared more frequently than the submarine commanders had expected, forcing boats to dive and lose the advantage of the surface. On one of the escorts, the radar operator called out a contact that had appeared suddenly on his screen. The ship altered course and closed in. When the submarine was forced to dive, the depth charge patterns began again. This time the sea gave them what they were looking for. Debris and oil rose to the surface, and the men on the escort knew they had struck a blow in return. For the survivors in the water and in the lifeboats, the storm made everything harder and, in some ways, strangely simpler. There was no time for anything but the immediate struggle to stay alive. A group of men from two different ships found themselves in the same lifeboat, riding the huge waves and bailing constantly to keep the boat from swamping. One of them, a stoker who had been on his first long voyage, quietly told the others about his home and his family. The others listened without interrupting. In the middle of the destruction, those small stories became a way of holding onto something human. When the storm finally began to ease, they saw the lights of a rescue ship in the distance and raised their voices together, calling out until they were heard. On the submarines, the success of the initial attacks was tempered by the growing realization that this convoy was fighting back harder than the ones in march. Some of the boats had been driven off or damaged by the escorts and the aircraft. The weather that had helped scatter the targets had also made it harder to press home every attack. A commander on one of the surviving U-boats surfaced after a long period submerged and looked out at the dark water. He had achieved what he had been sent to do, but the cost in boats and men was already higher than he had expected. He gave the order to withdraw and report, knowing that the pack's great offensive was not going as planned. Inside the hull, the crew sat in exhausted silence. They had done their duty, but the sea had not given them the easy victory they had hoped for. The escorts that had stayed with the remnants of the convoy through the storm and the attacks felt a quiet pride in what they had accomplished. They had not been able to save every ship, but they had driven off or destroyed enough of the attackers to give the surviving merchantmen a chance. On one of the escort vessels, the commander gathered his men after the immediate danger had passed. He spoke quietly about the long night they had just lived through and about the men who had not made it. He did not try to hide the cost. He simply thanked them for staying at their posts and for fighting back when everything had seemed stacked against them. The men listened in silence. They knew they had done something important, even if the victory was measured in ships saved rather than ships sunk. For the survivors who eventually reached port, the memory of that storm-tossed battle stayed with them long after the physical wounds had healed. They spoke of it in quiet conversations or carried it in silence. The letters they wrote home tried to balance the truth of what had happened with the need not to frighten the people who were waiting. A young sailor who had spent hours in a lifeboat wrote to his mother that he was safe and that the sea had been rough, but that he was looking forward to coming home. He did not describe the fires or the cold or the way the older men in the boat had quietly made sure the younger ones had the best chance. Those details he kept for himself, another layer added to the ones that had already changed him. The battle around that scattered convoy marked a turning point in the long struggle for the Atlantic. The packs had still been able to inflict heavy losses, but they had done so at a cost that was beginning to feel unsustainable. The escorts had learned to fight back more effectively even when outnumbered and in terrible weather. The aircraft that had once been too few and too far away were now appearing in numbers that forced the submarines to spend more time submerged and less time hunting. The men on both sides sensed that the balance was shifting, even if the full weight of that shift would not be felt until the weeks that followed. If the courage of the men who fought through that storm, the merchant sailors who refused to give up their ships, the escort crews who turned defense into attack, and the submarine men who faced a changing sea with the same determination they had always shown, has reminded you how much these stories of shared sacrifice still matter across every theater of the war, then you may want to hold a piece of that history yourself. Dedicated World War II enthusiasts can discover authentic naval memorabilia, carefully chosen books about the men who served at sea, and powerful films like Midway on Prime Video that honor the courage and sacrifice of sailors across every theater of the war. These are tangible ways to keep the memory of that shared humanity alive. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The storm had scattered the convoy and the pack alike, but it had also revealed something important about the men who sailed those waters. The hunters had not been broken, but they had been forced to reckon with a resistance that was growing stronger with every passing week. The hunted had endured losses that would have broken lesser men, yet they had stayed together and fought back when everything seemed lost. The sea itself had been both enemy and witness, and in the end it had shown that no advantage, no matter how great, could last forever when ordinary men refused to accept defeat. The packs would try again in the weeks that followed, but something fundamental had changed in those stormy days. The hunters were still dangerous, but the hunted had begun to turn the sea against them. The long reversal had started, and the men who lived through it would carry the memory of that storm-tossed battle for the rest of their lives. The sea that had once carried the Wolfpacks to victory turned against them in May with a fury that no amount of courage or skill could withstand, and the men who had believed they could still starve an island into submission watched their world collapse boat by boat. The attacks continued into the first days of the month with the same determination that had marked the earlier spring offensives. Packs still formed, still received orders to concentrate on the remaining convoy routes, and still sent their boats out into waters that felt increasingly hostile. Inside the submarines, the crews went about their work with the grim focus of men who sensed that something fundamental had changed. A young torpedo man on one of the boats that sailed in early May checked his settings with extra care, thinking of the letter he had received at the base from his mother. She had written about the garden coming into bloom and about how the neighbors asked after him. He had folded the letter and tucked it away, telling himself he would answer it when they returned. He did not write about the way the older hands had grown quieter in the mess, or about the way the commander had looked at the latest reports with an expression that was hard to read. On the other side of the same ocean, the escorts and the aircraft that hunted them had learned their trade in the hardest possible school. They no longer waited passively for the attackers to come. They searched, they closed in, they stayed with the contact until it was destroyed or driven so deep it could no longer threaten the ships they protected. On one of the support groups that operated independently of any single convoy, the commander watched his ships work a suspected contact with the patience of men who had done this many times before. The sea gave them what they were looking for. When the charges finally found their mark and the water went still, the men on the bridge exchanged no celebrations. They simply marked the position, turned for the next patrol line, and prepared themselves for whatever the next day would bring. They knew that every boat they removed from the fight meant fewer torpedoes aimed at the convoys still crossing. The losses mounted with a speed that shocked even the men who had lived through the earlier years of the campaign. Boats that had been considered lucky, boats that had survived dozens of patrols, failed to return. Reports came in of aircraft appearing where none should have been, of escorts arriving with an accuracy that suggested they knew exactly where to look. Inside the remaining submarines, the crews endured attacks that seemed to go on for hours. A commander on one boat that survived a particularly heavy assault gathered his men afterward and spoke quietly about what they had just lived through. He did not try to hide the danger. He simply told them that the enemy had grown stronger and that they would have to be smarter and more careful if they were to have any chance of coming home. The men listened in silence. They had already seen too many empty places at the tables and the bases. They knew the commander was right, but knowing did not make the fear any smaller. For the men on the Allied side, the successes brought a complicated mixture of relief and sorrow. They had spent months watching convoys suffer and ships disappear. Now, for the first time in a long while, they were the ones inflicting the losses. On one of the escort carriers that operated in the Mid-Atlantic, a young pilot returned from a patrol that had ended with a submarine caught on the surface. He had pressed the attack as he had been trained to do, watching the tracers from his guns reach out across the water. Later, in the ready room, he sat with the other aircrew and tried to steady his hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. One of his squadron mates passed him a cigarette without a word. They did not talk much about what they had done. They simply shared the silence of men who understood that every victory carried its own cost in human lives. The pressure on the U-boat arm grew heavier with every passing day. Boats that sailed out with full crews and high hopes often failed to send even a single message after they left the patrol lines. The bases along the French coast began to feel the absence in ways that could not be ignored. Empty bunks, half-finished letters, photographs left behind on lockers. The men who remained spoke in lower voices and checked their equipment with extra care, as if precision could somehow protect them from whatever had claimed their shipmates. A petty officer who had served since the early days of the war found himself writing a letter to the family of a young rating who had been lost on a boat that never returned. He wrote about how the boy had been a good shipmate and how he had done his duty without complaint. He did not try to explain why one boat had come home and another had not. He simply folded the letter and placed it with the others that would be sent when the next boat sailed for home waters. In the headquarters far from the sea, the man who had shaped the Wolfpack strategy received the reports of losses with a growing sense of disbelief that slowly hardened into something closer to despair. He had believed, with every fiber of his being, that the submarines could still turn the tide if they were given enough boats and enough time. Now the numbers told a different story. Boat after boat was being lost to aircraft and to surface forces that seemed to appear from nowhere. The protective screen that had once allowed the packs to operate with relative freedom was being torn apart. He studied the charts and the signals and felt the weight of every missing boat settle on his shoulders. There were moments when he sat alone in his office and allowed himself to remember the young men who had followed him into this fight, men who had believed in the dream he had offered them. He did not speak of those moments to anyone. He simply carried them with the other burdens that came with command. The final blow came in the form of orders that no one had wanted to give and no one had wanted to receive. The decision was made to pull the remaining boats out of the North Atlantic convoy routes. The men who received the signal in their boats read it in silence. Some felt a rush of relief that the slaughter might finally end. Others felt only the hollow sense that something they had believed in was ending with it. On one of the last boats to receive the order, the commander gathered his crew and told them what had been decided. He spoke without drama or false hope. He simply said that they had done everything that had been asked of them and that the sea had decided the matter for now. The men listened and then returned to their stations. There was work to be done even in withdrawal, courses to be set, equipment to be secured, and the long, dangerous passage back to base to be faced. For the survivors who made it home, the return to the French ports was unlike any homecoming they had known. The bases that had once buzzed with the energy of men preparing for the next hunt now felt subdued, almost hollow. The men who stepped ashore carried the physical exhaustion of long patrols and the deeper exhaustion of having watched their world change in a single month. Some of them wrote letters home that tried to sound braver than they felt. Others sat in the mess halls and spoke quietly among themselves about the boats that had not come back and about the friends who would never sit at those tables again. A young rating who had survived the worst of the May losses found himself unable to sleep even after the boat was safely tied up. He kept seeing the faces of men who had been with him on earlier patrols and who were now gone. An older hand who had noticed his restlessness sat with him one evening and simply shared a cigarette and a few quiet words about how the sea sometimes took more than it gave. The younger man did not answer, but he felt the weight on his chest ease slightly. On the Allied side, the relief was real but never complete. The men who had fought through the long months of frustration now found themselves winning engagements they would have considered impossible only a year earlier. Yet they also knew that the cost had been measured in lives on both sides. On one of the escort groups that had been particularly active in the May battles, the commander received word that his own son, serving on another ship, had been lost in an earlier action. He read the message in private and then returned to his duties without a word to his crew. They sensed the change in him and gave him the space he needed. Later, when the immediate pressure had eased, he wrote a letter to his wife that said only what needed to be said. He did not try to explain why one man had survived and another had not. He simply told her that he loved her and that he would come home when the work was done. The month that had begun with the same offensive spirit that had carried the packs through the spring ended with the recognition that the dream of controlling the Atlantic through submarine warfare had been broken. The boats that remained were still dangerous, still capable of individual successes, but the coordinated mass attacks that had once threatened to strangle the lifelines to Britain were no longer possible. The men who had lived through Black May carried the memory of it with them for the rest of their lives. Some would sail again on other fronts or in other roles. Others would never forget the feeling of watching the sea turn against them in a way that no amount of skill or courage could overcome. The hunters had become the hunted in a way that left no room for illusions. The dream that had begun in the training grounds years earlier and had reached its height in the months when the packs had seemed unstoppable had ended in the cold waters of May, not with a single dramatic moment but with the steady, relentless accumulation of losses that finally made continuation impossible. The raw images that capture the true cost of those final days, the oil-slicked water where boats had gone down, the faces of men who knew they were living through the end of something they had believed in, the quiet exhaustion of crews who had done everything asked of them and still watched their world collapse, are preserved in photographs and footage that are often too visceral and heartbreaking to show openly. Our special Gumroad collection holds raw, uncensored material from the U-boat campaign that reveals the true face of submarine warfare in ways words alone cannot convey. If you want to see the unfiltered human cost that shaped these stories, this is where you can find it. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The sea that had once seemed to belong to the Wolfpacks had shown them, in the space of a single month, that no advantage lasts forever when the enemy learns to fight back with every tool at his disposal. The men who had once moved through the Atlantic with the confidence of hunters now moved with the caution of prey that had finally understood the size and the reach of the forces arrayed against them. The dream of victory through submarine warfare had not died in a single dramatic moment. It had eroded, boat by boat and day by day, until the only choice left was to pull back and accept that the Atlantic, for now, belonged to someone else. The men who survived carried that knowledge with them into the months and years that followed. Some would find ways to live with it. Others would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand how a dream that had felt so certain could have ended so completely in the cold, gray waters of a single terrible spring. The war at sea would continue, but the great offensive that had once promised to decide everything had reached its end. The hunters had become the hunted, and the sea had decided the matter in a way that left no room for argument. They no longer hunted on the surface like wolves, now they crept beneath it like ghosts, breathing through a mechanical straw that brought air but also the constant threat of discovery and the choking reality of their own exhaust. The order to withdraw from the North Atlantic had been difficult enough to accept. The men who had once believed they could still turn the tide found themselves back in the French bases with empty places at every table and a silence that felt heavier than any depth charge. Yet even in that silence there was talk of adaptation, of new equipment that might allow them to return to the fight without repeating the slaughter of May. The device was simple in concept, a retractable tube that could be raised like a periscope to draw in fresh air and expel diesel exhaust while the boat remained submerged. In theory, it would let them recharge their batteries and run their engines without surfacing for long periods, robbing the enemy aircraft of their easiest targets. In practice, it turned every patrol into a new kind of ordeal. On one of the first boats fitted with the snorkel, the crew gathered in the control room to watch the device being tested. The tube rose with a hydraulic hiss, and almost immediately the boat filled with the acrid smell of diesel exhaust mixed with the damp, metallic air of the submerged hull. Men coughed and wiped their eyes. The vibration from the engines running at snorkel depth traveled through the deck plates and into their bones. A young rating who had joined only the year before stood near the air intake and felt the rush of outside air against his face. For a moment it was almost pleasant, the first real breath of fresh air he had tasted in days. Then the exhaust began to back up, and the air grew thick and foul. He stepped back, fighting the urge to retch, and caught the eye of an older petty officer who had served since the early patrols. The older man gave a small, grim nod, as if to say this was the price they would all pay now. No one spoke of glory or easy victories. They simply returned to their stations and prepared for what lay ahead. The transit across the Bay of Biscay became the new test of endurance. What had once been a relatively quick passage on the surface now had to be made mostly submerged, with the snorkel raised only when absolutely necessary. The boats moved slowly, their batteries draining faster than they could be recharged in the short windows when the tube could safely be used. Aircraft patrolled the bay day and night, their radar reaching down through the darkness and their searchlights suddenly stabbing the water when a surfaced boat was spotted. On one boat that attempted the crossing in early summer, the commander kept the vessel as deep as he dared during daylight hours, surfacing only briefly at night to run the diesels and refresh the air. Even then, the snorkel had to be raised with extreme caution. The lookout on the bridge watched the sky constantly, his nerves stretched thin by the knowledge that any glint of moonlight on the tube or any radar reflection could bring death from above within minutes. Inside the hull, the conditions were worse than anything most of the crew had experienced. The air grew stale quickly when the snorkel could not be used. Men slept in shifts on damp bunks, their clothes stiff with salt and sweat. The smell of diesel, battery acid, and unwashed bodies hung in every compartment. A young crew member who had once written cheerful letters home now found himself staring at the same blank sheet of paper for hours, unable to find words that would not frighten his family. He finally wrote only that the patrols were long and that he missed the smell of the fields after rain. He did not mention the way the boat sometimes felt more like a tomb than a warship, or the way the older men had stopped joking about what they would do when the war ended. The aircraft attacks came without warning. On one boat, the first indication was the sudden roar of engines overhead and the sharp crack of cannon fire striking the water around the raised snorkel. The commander gave the order to dive at once. The tube was retracted in seconds, but not before the boat had taken damage. Depth charges followed, rolling through the water in patterns that shook every rivet. The men lay where they could, bracing themselves against the bulkheads, listening to the explosions grow closer and then, mercifully, fade. When the attack finally ended, the boat surfaced cautiously. The snorkel tube was bent and useless. The commander looked at it for a long moment before giving the order to continue on battery power alone. They would have to make the rest of the crossing submerged, conserving every amp of power, knowing that if they were forced to surface again, the enemy would almost certainly be waiting. Small acts of kindness kept the crews from breaking under the strain. On one boat, a petty officer noticed a young rating shivering in his damp clothes after a long watch and quietly gave him his own dry sweater without a word. On another, the cook somehow managed to produce a hot meal from the limited stores, carrying bowls of soup to men who had not left their stations for hours. These gestures were never dramatic, but they mattered more than anyone admitted. They reminded the men that they were still human even when the boat felt like a steel coffin drifting through hostile water. A commander who had once led packs with confidence now made a point of speaking individually with every man on his crew during the long submerged periods, asking about their families or their homes, listening without offering false hope. The men appreciated the effort even when they could not bring themselves to speak of their own fears. The return to the Atlantic, when it finally came, felt more like a desperate gamble than a return to glory. The boats that made it through the Biscay transit found waters that were no longer the hunting ground they remembered. Convoys were better protected, air cover was denser, and the escorts seemed to appear with an accuracy that suggested they knew exactly where to look. Some commanders tried to adapt the old tactics, forming small groups and attempting coordinated attacks, but the results were rarely what they had once been. A boat that managed to sink a single merchantman now counted itself fortunate. More often the attackers were driven off or forced to dive before they could press home an assault. The men inside those boats felt the shift in the war with every failed approach. They were no longer the wolves of the Atlantic. They were survivors, doing their best to stay alive in a sea that had turned against them. Letters home became shorter and more guarded. A young crew member who had once filled pages with descriptions of the sea and the excitement of the hunt now wrote only that he was well and that he hoped his family was safe. He did not mention the way the boat sometimes smelled of fear as much as diesel, or the way the men had stopped talking about what they would do after the war. His mother, reading those brief lines in a kitchen far from the sea, sensed the change even if she could not name it. She wrote back asking about the weather and about whether he was eating properly, the ordinary questions that became a way of reaching across the distance and the silence. The psychological toll grew heavier with every patrol. Men who had once slept soundly between watches now lay awake listening to the hull creak and the distant sound of aircraft engines. Claustrophobia became a constant companion for some, especially during the long hours when the boat had to remain deep to avoid detection. A rating who had always been steady found himself breaking into a sweat whenever the order came to dive for an extended period. He hid it as best he could, but the older hands noticed and quietly made sure he was never left alone at his station for too long. These small kindnesses did not fix the fear, but they made it bearable. Even the commanders who had once believed most strongly in the submarine war began to carry a private doubt. On one boat that had survived the Biscay crossing and managed a brief, unsuccessful attack on a convoy, the commander sat in his tiny cabin after the boat had returned to base and stared at the chart on his desk. He had done everything that training and experience had taught him to do, yet the results had been meager and the cost and strain on his crew had been enormous. He thought about the men who had not returned from earlier patrols and about the ones who were still with him, growing thinner and quieter with every voyage. He did not write any of this down. He simply folded the chart away and went to speak with his men, offering what encouragement he could. The words felt hollow even to him, but he spoke them anyway because it was all he had left to give. The desperate return to the Atlantic had been achieved at a cost that no one in the bases wanted to calculate too closely. Boats that had once sailed with full crews and high hopes now returned with gaps in their complement and an exhaustion that sleep could not cure. The snorkel had given them a way to move without surfacing for long periods, but it had not given them back the freedom or the dominance they had once known. The men who lived through those months carried the memory of the choking air, the constant vibration, and the endless watchfulness with them long after the war ended. Some would speak of it only in fragments, years later, to people who had never smelled diesel in a steel tube or felt the hull shudder from a near-miss depth charge. Others would carry the silence inside them, another weight added to the ones they had already learned to bear. The sea had not changed. It was still cold and vast and unforgiving. What had changed was the men who sailed upon it and the machines they trusted with their lives. The snorkel had been a desperate measure born of necessity, a way to keep fighting when every other option had been taken away. It had allowed some boats to return to the Atlantic, but it had not restored the dream that had once seemed within reach. The hunters were still dangerous, still capable of individual successes, but the coordinated power that had once threatened to decide the war was gone. The men who remained did their duty with whatever courage they could find, breathing through the mechanical straw that kept them alive while slowly stealing the air they needed to truly live. They did not speak of victory anymore. They spoke only of survival, and of the hope that somewhere, beyond the next patrol and the one after that, there might still be a way home. If the endurance of these men, the ones who adapted to breathing through a straw in the depths while the sea and the enemy closed in around them, has stayed with you, and if you want to help keep their voices and the voices of all the forgotten crews from this war alive, then there is a simple way to make a real difference. You can leave a small tip, even just $1, on Ko-Fi to help sustain the countless hours of research, survivor interviews, and careful storytelling required to bring these hidden chapters back into the light. It truly helps us continue this work. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The return had been desperate, and the cost had been higher than anyone had wanted to admit. The boats that made it back to the French ports carried crews who had learned a new kind of war. One fought in the dark, in the foul air of their own exhaust, with the constant knowledge that the enemy was learning faster than they could adapt. The dream of the Wolfpacks had not died in a single dramatic moment. It had faded, patrol by patrol, as the men who had once moved across the Atlantic with such deadly freedom found themselves reduced to creeping through the depths, grateful for every breath of air that came through a mechanical tube. They had not given up. They had simply learned, in the hardest way possible, that even the most powerful weapons eventually meet their match when the sea and the enemy refuse to yield. The hunters were still out there, still dangerous, but the sea that had once seemed to belong to them now belonged to no one. It simply waited, cold and vast, for whoever would next trust their lives to its surface. They were supposed to be the boats that would turn the tide once more, sleek and powerful machines that could hunt in the depths with a freedom the old wolves had lost, but by the time they reached the sea, the war had already moved beyond them. The men who first saw the plans for these new submarines felt something they had not felt in a long time, genuine hope. In the cramped offices and drawing rooms where the designs were studied, officers and engineers gathered around tables covered in blueprints and spoke in low, excited voices about what these boats could do. They would be faster underwater than anything that had come before. They would carry more torpedoes and stay out longer without needing to surface. The living conditions inside would be better, with more space for the crews who had grown used to cramped steel tubes that smelled of diesel and fear. For men who had lived through the slaughter of Black May and the choking misery of snorkel patrols, these promises felt like a second chance. A young commander who had survived one of the last mass attacks in the Atlantic stood in one of those rooms and traced the lines of the new hull with his finger. He did not say much. He simply nodded, as if the drawings themselves were proof that the dream was not yet dead. The reality of building them was nothing like the drawings. The shipyards that were supposed to produce these boats in large numbers were already under constant attack from the air. Workers arrived each morning to find sections of the assembly halls collapsed or burning. They cleared debris by hand, repaired what they could, and tried to keep the lines moving. One foreman, a man who had worked in the yards since before the war, spent his days moving between teams of exhausted welders and fitters, offering quiet encouragement and sometimes sharing his own rations when someone looked too thin. He had lost 2 sons in the war already, one on a surface ship and one in a submarine that never returned. He did not speak of them. He simply kept working, because stopping felt like giving up on the only thing he still believed might make a difference. The crews chosen for these new boats were often a mixture of survivors from older submarines and younger men who had never been to sea in anything larger than a training vessel. They arrived at the fitting-out yards with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The boats looked different even from the outside, more streamlined, almost graceful in a way that the older Type WWIIs had never been. Inside, the difference was even more striking. There were proper bunks instead of hammocks in some compartments, better ventilation, and space that felt almost luxurious after the iron coffins they had known. A young rating who had spent months on a snorkel boat stood in one of the new control rooms and simply stared for a moment. He had not realized how much he had grown used to the constant smell of fumes and damp until he stepped into air that did not immediately make his eyes water. An older petty officer who had been assigned to help train the new crews watched the young man's reaction and allowed himself a small smile. It was the first time in months he had seen anyone look at a submarine with anything resembling hope. The problems began almost as soon as the boats put to sea for trials. The advanced systems that were supposed to make them superior turned out to be temperamental. Batteries that were meant to give extended underwater endurance sometimes failed without warning. The new hydrophones and listening equipment required constant adjustment. The streamlined hulls that promised higher submerged speeds also made the boats harder to handle in certain sea conditions. On one of the early boats to complete its trials, the commander gathered his crew after a particularly frustrating day of tests and spoke plainly. He told them that the boat was still learning how to be what it was meant to be, and that they would have to learn with it. There was no anger in his voice, only a quiet determination that the men recognized from their own experiences. They returned to their stations without complaint. Some of them had already survived enough patrols to know that complaining rarely changed anything. What mattered was doing the work in front of them as well as they could. Even when the boats began to reach operational status, the war they were meant to fight had changed. The Atlantic that had once been a hunting ground was now heavily patrolled by aircraft that could detect a surfaced submarine from far away and attack before the boat could dive. The new boats were designed to spend most of their time submerged, but even they could not stay down forever. When they did surface to recharge or to transmit, the old dangers returned. A commander who took one of the first operational boats on a patrol in the final months of the war found himself forced to dive repeatedly as aircraft appeared on the horizon. Each time the boat went deep, the crew waited in the dim red lighting of the control room, listening to the distant sound of engines and wondering whether this would be the patrol where their luck finally ran out. The boat itself performed better than anything they had known before, faster, quieter, more capable, but the sea around it had become too hostile for even these advantages to matter as much as they should have. The disappointment was quiet but profound. Men who had pinned their hopes on these boats as the thing that would finally turn the tide began to understand that no single weapon, no matter how advanced, could overcome the accumulated weight of everything that had gone before. The shipyards continued to work under the bombs, producing boats that were impressive on paper but arrived in numbers too small and too late to change the larger picture. Crews trained hard and did their best, but many of them sensed that they were fighting in a war whose outcome had already been decided somewhere else. A young officer who had been given command of one of the new boats wrote a letter to his wife after his first patrol. He told her that the boat was everything they had been promised and more, but that the sea itself seemed different now. He did not write about the empty feeling he carried after returning with no successes to report. He simply said that he loved her and that he hoped the war would end soon so he could come home. She read the letter in a small apartment far from the coast and felt the weight of what he had not said. There were moments of genuine achievement even in the midst of the larger failure. One boat managed to complete a long patrol and return with useful intelligence about enemy shipping movements. Another evaded a prolonged hunt by aircraft and escorts through a combination of the new boat's capabilities and the skill of its crew. These small victories were celebrated quietly in the bases, not with the exuberance of earlier years, but with a sober recognition that every day the boat stayed at sea was a day they had not been lost. The men who achieved these things did not feel like heroes. They felt like survivors who had done what was asked of them in a situation that offered little room for heroism of the old kind. The human cost of the program was measured not only in the boats that never reached the sea but in the men who gave everything to the effort. Shipyard workers died under the bombs. Crews were lost during training accidents or on the few operational patrols that were attempted. Families received telegrams that said little and explained nothing. A mother in a small town who had already lost one son to the sea received word that her second son, who had been training on one of the new boats, would not be coming home either. She sat at her kitchen table with the telegram in her hands and did not cry. She simply folded it carefully and placed it with the other papers she kept in a small wooden box. There were no words left that could make sense of what had happened. By the final weeks of the war, the Type XXI boats that had once represented the future of submarine warfare had become symbols of something else entirely, the gap between what might have been and what actually was. A few of them saw limited action. Most remained in port or were scuttled by their own crews when the end came. The men who had worked on them or sailed in them carried the memory of that gap with them. Some would speak of the boats years later with a mixture of pride and sorrow, pride in what had been achieved under impossible conditions, sorrow that it had not been enough. Others would say little, because the story of boats that came too late was also the story of a war that had already been lost long before the last torpedo was fired. If the quiet tragedy of these advanced machines, the hope they carried, the suffering that went into building them, and the crushing realization that even the best technology could not overcome time itself, has left you wanting to explore more of the human stories behind the machines of this war, then our Patreon community is built exactly for that. History lovers there gain access to uncensored deep dive podcasts, raw video segments without blurring, exclusive collections of survivor letters, and a warm circle of fellow enthusiasts who refuse to let these stories fade. It is a place where the full weight of what these men lived through can be explored together. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The boats that were meant to restore the Wolfpacks to dominance arrived in a world that no longer had room for them. The men who had believed in them did their duty with whatever courage they could find, even when they understood that courage alone could not change what had already been decided. They lived inside the gap between promise and reality, between the sleek lines on the drawing boards and the bombed-out shipyards, between the hope of a new kind of submarine war and the old, grinding truth that wars are won or lost by the accumulation of small, human moments rather than by any single machine. The sea remained indifferent to all of it. It simply waited, as it always had, for the next generation of men to trust their lives to its surface and discover for themselves what the last generation had already learned, that even the most advanced boats eventually meet a sea that has learned how to fight back. The great packs that had once moved across the Atlantic like a single deadly organism had been reduced to smaller groups that still tried to hunt together, but the sea and the enemy had learned too much for the old songs to work as they once had. The men who sailed in those final attempts carried a different kind of courage than the ones who had gone out in the early years. Many of them were young, some barely out of training, and they had inherited a war that was already turning against them in ways their predecessors had never faced. They knew the stories of the earlier successes, the nights when convoys had scattered under massed torpedo attacks and the Atlantic had seemed to belong to the submarines. Those stories were told in the messes during the long transits, sometimes with pride and sometimes with a quiet understanding that those days would not return. A young commander who had been given charge of one of the last small groups sat with his officers before a patrol and listened as they spoke of what they hoped to achieve. He did not interrupt with false promises. He simply told them that they would do what they could with the boats they had and the men they had become. The officers nodded. They had already seen enough to know that courage now meant something quieter than it had once meant, the willingness to keep going when every signal and every patrol report suggested that the odds were growing longer. The transit to the hunting grounds had become one of the most dangerous parts of any patrol. The loss of the French bases after the Normandy landings meant that the boats had to travel much farther, often from Norwegian ports, and the routes took them through waters heavily patrolled by Allied aircraft. On one boat that left in the spring of that year, the crew spent days submerged, using the snorkel only when the batteries were critically low. The air inside the hull grew thick and foul quickly. Men took turns standing near the air intake when it was raised, breathing in the outside air as if it were a luxury. A young rating who had never been on a long patrol before found himself coughing from the diesel fumes that sometimes backed up into the boat. An older petty officer noticed and quietly moved him to a different station where the air was slightly better. He did not make a show of it. He simply said that the new man needed to keep his strength for when it mattered most. The younger man nodded in thanks and returned to his work, carrying the small kindness with him through the rest of the watch. When the boats finally reached the convoy routes, they found a different kind of war than the one they had trained for. Convoys were now protected by layers of escorts and aircraft that could appear at any moment. The old tactic of gathering several boats to strike from multiple directions was still attempted, but the coordination was harder to maintain. Radio silence was more strictly enforced because any transmission could bring aircraft or hunter-killer groups within minutes. On one of the small groups that managed to locate a convoy, the commander gave the order to attack in the early hours of the morning. The sea was rough, the visibility poor, and the escorts were alert. Torpedoes were fired from several boats, and a few found their marks. On the merchant ships the night turned into the familiar chaos of explosions and alarms. Men who had been asleep or on watch found themselves struggling through smoke and darkness to reach the lifeboats. Some of the survivors later spoke of how the attack had come from different directions at once, just as the old packs had done, but there was less exultation in the telling than there might once have been. The victory, if it could be called that, felt smaller and more costly than the ones they had heard about from earlier years. Inside the attacking submarines the mood was equally mixed. The crews had done what they had been sent to do, but they knew that the escorts would not let them linger. Depth charges began to roll almost immediately, and the boats were forced to dive and scatter. On one submarine the commander kept the vessel deep for hours while the charges shook the hull. The men lay where they could, bracing themselves against the movement and listening to the distant explosions. A young crew member who had been at his station for a long watch found his hands shaking from exhaustion and fear. The petty officer beside him reached over without a word and steadied the valve the younger man had been adjusting. It was a small gesture, but in the dim red light of the control room it felt like an anchor. When the attack finally eased, the boat surfaced cautiously. The commander looked out at the dark water and the distant lights of the convoy still moving away. He gave the order to withdraw rather than press another attack. The risk was too high, and the gain too uncertain. The men accepted the decision without argument. They had already learned that survival sometimes required knowing when to stop. The letters that traveled between the boats and the homes far away carried less of the old confidence. A commander who had once written about the excitement of the hunt now wrote shorter notes that said only that he was well and that the patrols were long. He did not describe the constant tension of listening for aircraft or the way the crew had grown quieter with each failed approach. His wife, reading those lines in a small apartment, sensed the change even if she could not name it. She wrote back asking about the weather at sea and whether he was getting enough rest, the ordinary questions that became a way of reaching across the distance. On the boat itself, the men sometimes shared fragments of letters they had received. One evening after a difficult watch, a young rating read aloud a line from his sister's letter about the flowers blooming in the garden at home. The others listened without interrupting. Those small moments of connection to the world they had left behind helped keep the fear from taking complete hold. The psychological strain of these final attempts was visible in ways it had not been before. Men who had once slept soundly between watches now lay awake listening to every creak of the hull. The constant threat of detection meant that even routine surfacing to run the diesels or refresh the air carried a heavy risk. On one boat that had been forced to dive 3 times in a single night because of aircraft, the commander noticed that several of his younger crew members were showing signs of exhaustion that went beyond simple tiredness. He made a point of speaking with each of them individually during the quieter hours, asking about their homes or their families, listening without offering advice that he could not honestly give. The men appreciated the effort. It reminded them that they were still part of something larger than their own fear, even when that something was shrinking with every patrol that failed to return. There were still moments when the old tactics produced results. A small group that managed to stay coordinated through careful planning and good luck found a convoy that was less heavily protected than most. The attack was pressed home with the discipline that had once been the hallmark of the packs. Several ships were hit, and the escorts were caught off balance for a time. On the submarines, the crews felt a brief surge of the old satisfaction, the sense that they were still capable of striking effectively when everything aligned. Yet even in that moment there was an awareness that the success was temporary. The escorts would recover, the aircraft would return, and the boats would have to scatter or risk being hunted down themselves. The commander who had led the attack gave the order to withdraw as soon as the immediate danger had passed. He did not linger to press for more. The risk was too high, and the gain, while real, would not change the larger picture. For the men who survived these final attempts, the return to base brought a mixture of relief and quiet disillusionment. The bases themselves had changed. Many of the old French ports were gone, and the remaining facilities felt smaller and more isolated. The men who stepped ashore carried the physical exhaustion of long patrols and the deeper exhaustion of having fought in a war whose outcome they could no longer influence in any meaningful way. Some of them wrote letters home that tried to sound braver than they felt. Others sat in the mess halls and spoke quietly among themselves about the boats that had not come back and about the friends who would. Never sit at those tables again. A young rating who had been on one of the last successful small group attacks found himself unable to sleep even after the boat was safely tied up. He kept seeing the faces of the men on the ships they had attacked and wondering whether any of them had families waiting the way his own family was waiting for him. An older hand who had noticed his restlessness sat with him one evening and simply shared a cigarette and a few quiet words about how the sea sometimes asked more of men than they had expected to give. The younger man did not answer, but he felt the weight on his chest ease slightly. The last attempts to operate in coordinated groups marked the end of an era that had begun with such promise years earlier. The men who had lived through those final patrols carried the memory of them with a complexity that later generations sometimes found difficult to understand. There was pride in having done what was asked of them even when the odds were against them. There was sorrow for the friends who had not returned and for the dream that had slowly faded with every passing month. And there was a quiet understanding that courage in the final stages of a losing war looked different from the courage that had been celebrated in the early victories. It was the courage of men who kept going not because they believed they could still win, but because stopping would have meant abandoning the only thing they still had left to hold on to, each other, and the stubborn refusal to let the sea take everything without a fight. If the quiet persistence of these men in the final, diminished attempts to hunt together, the small kindnesses that held crews together, the letters that tried to bridge the growing distance between the sea and home, and the complex weight of fighting on when the larger dream had already slipped away, has left you wanting to explore more of the hidden operations and forgotten courage that shaped this war, then our free email newsletter is the perfect place to continue the journey. You can instantly receive the exclusive ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, including the full hidden story of the Enigma captures, along with weekly dispatches that reveal the espionage, the courage, and the forgotten heroes who worked in the shadows behind the headlines. It is a way to keep these stories alive in your own inbox. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The packs that had once moved with such deadly coordination across the Atlantic had become shadows of what they had been. The men who still tried to hunt together did so with skill and determination, but the sea no longer answered to their calls in the same way. The old songs had grown faint, and the enemy had learned to listen for them and to answer with forces that could not be evaded by courage alone. The final attempts in 1944 were not the dramatic last stands that later stories sometimes made them out to be. They were quieter, more stubborn, and in many ways more human, the efforts of ordinary men who had been asked to keep fighting long after the larger war had moved beyond the reach of the weapons they carried. They did what they could with what they had, and when the patrols ended they carried the memory of those last howls with them into whatever future remained. The Atlantic remained vast and cold and unforgiving, but the men who had once believed they could master it had learned, in the hardest way possible, that even the strongest packs eventually meet a sea that has learned how to fight back. The last echoes of the old songs faded into the wind, and the war at sea entered its final, inevitable chapter. In the final days of the war, the orders that reached the remaining boats were not to attack but to stop, and the men who had spent years hunting in the dark now faced a different kind of judgment from the sea they had served. The collapse came faster than many had expected. News traveled unevenly to the boats still at sea or tied up in the last northern ports. Some crews heard it first in broken radio transmissions that spoke of the end in Berlin and the change in leadership. Others learned it when messengers arrived at the jetties with sealed orders that no one wanted to open. On one submarine still preparing for what its commander had been told would be another patrol, the men gathered in the control room while the orders were read aloud. The words were simple and final. They were to cease all offensive operations. They were to make for the nearest Allied port or, if that was not possible, to scuttle their boat and surrender. The commander finished reading and looked at the faces around him. Some were young men who had joined only months earlier and had never known anything but the long retreat. Others were older hands who had survived the early patrols and the terrible spring of the year before. No one spoke for a moment. Then one of the petty officers asked quietly what they were supposed to do with the torpedoes still in their tubes. The commander answered that they would be jettisoned or destroyed. There would be no more attacks. The war at sea, for them, was over. On another boat already at sea, the signal arrived in the middle of a routine watch. The commander read it twice before passing it to his officers. They stood together in the small wardroom while the boat continued on its course, the diesels still running because no one had yet given the order to change anything. The news brought a strange mixture of relief and something harder to name. They had been expecting this moment for weeks, yet hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that rumors never had. A young rating who had been at his station when the signal came found himself thinking about his family and about whether they already knew the war was ending. He had written a letter only a few days earlier that was still in his pocket, waiting for a chance to post it. Now he wondered if there would ever be a post office again that would take a letter from a surrendered submarine. The decision to scuttle or to surrender was not always simple. Some commanders chose to take their boats into remote fjords or to isolated anchorages where they could open the seacocks and let the water claim the holes they had lived inside for so long. On one such boat the crew worked in near silence as they prepared the charges and opened the valves. The sound of water rushing into the lower compartments was steady and final. Men moved through the passageways collecting personal items, photographs, letters, small tokens they had carried through years of patrols. One young crew member paused beside the periscope and touched it for a moment, as if saying goodbye to the only home he had known for most of his adult life. An older man who had served on the same boat since its first patrol helped him carry a last bundle of belongings to the deck. They did not speak of what they had done together or of the friends who had not lived to see this day. They simply worked until the boat began to settle and then climbed into the small boats that would take them to shore. Other crews chose to surrender at sea when they encountered Allied vessels. The signals exchanged were careful and formal. On one submarine, the commander ordered the boat to surface and the white flag to be raised. The crew stood on the casing in the cold air, watching as the Allied destroyer approached. The moment was tense but not hostile. When the boarding party came across in a small boat, the German commander met them at the hatch and saluted. The Allied officer returned the salute and asked if there were any wounded aboard. The German answered that there were none, only tired men who wanted to go home. The two officers stood for a moment on the wet steel while the sea moved around them. Then the Allied officer gave the order for his men to take control of the boat. The German crew was moved to the destroyer, where they were given blankets and hot drinks. Some of the Allied sailors spoke quietly among themselves about how young many of the prisoners looked. Others simply did their jobs without comment. The war had taught them that the men on the other side were not always the monsters the propaganda had described. There were still moments of fighting even in those final hours. A few boats received contradictory orders or chose to ignore the surrender signals for a time. On one submarine that encountered a small merchant vessel in the last days, the commander gave the order to attack before the full weight of the new instructions had reached him. The torpedo struck, and the merchant ship began to sink. The men on the submarine watched the lifeboats being lowered and felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and unease that had accompanied every successful attack. Only later, when the full orders arrived, did they understand that they had fired one of the last torpedoes of the war. The commander logged the action without celebration. He simply noted the time and position and then gave the order to proceed toward the nearest port where surrender could be arranged. The crew accepted the decision without argument. They had done what they believed was their duty, and now the duty had changed. For the men who survived to be taken prisoner or to reach shore under their own power, the end brought a complicated kind of peace. They were alive when so many others were not. They had endured years of cramped quarters, bad air, depth charges, and the constant fear that the next patrol would be the one that did not return. Now they faced an uncertain future in a defeated country, but at least the sea would no longer be trying to kill them every day. On one small boat that had been scuttled in a Norwegian inlet, the crew sat on the rocky shore and watched their submarine settle lower in the water until only the conning tower remained visible. One of the younger men asked quietly what they were supposed to do now. An older hand answered that they were supposed to wait for whatever came next, Allied soldiers, perhaps, or Norwegian authorities, or simply the chance to walk away from the war. The younger man nodded. He had not expected the end to feel so ordinary. There were letters written in those final days that would never be sent. A commander who had chosen to scuttle his boat sat in a small hut near the shore and wrote to his wife about the years they had spent apart and about the men who had served with him. He did not describe the details of the scuttling or the look on the faces of his crew when the water began to claim the boat. He simply told her that he was alive and that he hoped to see her soon. The letter was folded carefully and placed in his pocket. He did not know if it would ever reach her, but writing the words had felt necessary. On another boat that had surrendered at sea, a young crew member found a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote a few lines to his mother. He told her that the war was over for him and that he was safe. He did not mention the long nights of fear or the way the sea had taken so many of his friends. He simply said that he loved her and that he would try to come home as soon as he was allowed. The letter was taken from him when he was searched, but the act of writing it had given him something to hold onto in the hours that followed. The sea itself seemed to pass its own quiet judgment on the final patrols. Some boats that had been scuttled in shallow water remained partially visible for years afterward, rusting memorials to the men who had lived and died inside them. Others sank in deeper water and were never seen again. A few that had tried to continue fighting in the last hours were sunk by Allied forces and took their crews with them. The survivors who were pulled from the water in those final days spoke later of the strange calm that had settled over them once the decision to surrender or scuttle had been made. The long struggle was over. The sea that had been both enemy and home for so many years had finally released them, not because they had won but because the larger war had ended. On the Allied side, the victory at sea was felt as a gradual lifting of tension rather than a single dramatic moment. Escort commanders who had spent years protecting convoys received the news with the same mixture of relief and exhaustion that their former enemies were feeling. On one destroyer that had taken a surrendering U-boat under escort, the captain stood on the bridge and watched the German crew being brought aboard. He had lost friends to submarines earlier in the war, and he had sent men to their deaths in return. Now he found himself responsible for the safety of the very men who had once tried to kill him. He gave orders that the prisoners were to be treated correctly and that any who were injured were to receive medical attention. The war had taught him that the men on the other side were not always the monsters the propaganda had described. They were simply men who had done their duty as they understood it, just as he had done his. The final patrols ended not with a grand last battle but with quiet decisions made by tired men in steel boats far from home. Some chose to scuttle their vessels rather than hand them over. Others raised white flags and surrendered to whatever Allied ship found them first. The sea took some of them anyway, in those last confused hours when orders were contradictory or when old habits died hard. The men who survived carried the memory of those final days with them into whatever peace remained. They had lived through years of fear and loss, through the rise and fall of the Wolfpack dream, and through the long, grinding realization that even the most powerful weapons eventually meet their match. Now they faced an uncertain future, but at least the sea would no longer be trying to kill them every day. The war at sea had ended, and the judgment of the sea had been delivered in the form of survival for some and silence for others. The boats that had once hunted in packs were gone, scuttled, or surrendered or sunk in the final hours. The men who had sailed in them were left with the memories and with the knowledge that they had done what was asked of them until the asking stopped. The Atlantic remained vast and cold and unforgiving, but for the first time in years it was no longer a battlefield. It was simply the sea again, waiting for whatever came next. If the courage of the men who faced these final patrols, the quiet decisions to surrender or scuttle, the small kindnesses that held crews together in the last hours, and the shared humanity visible even in the moment of defeat, has reminded you how much these stories of sacrifice still matter across every theater of the war, then you may want to hold a piece of that history yourself. Dedicated World War II enthusiasts can discover authentic naval memorabilia, carefully chosen books about the men who served at sea, and powerful films like Midway on Prime Video that honor the courage and sacrifice of sailors across every theater of the war. These are tangible ways to keep the memory of that shared humanity alive. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The war at sea had ended the way it had begun for many of these men, with orders, with the sea, and with the simple fact that they were still alive when so many others were not. The final patrols had brought no dramatic victory and no dramatic defeat. They had brought only the end, and with the end came the chance to step away from the steel tubes that had been both prison and protector for so long. The men who had lived through those last days would carry the memory of them for the rest of their lives. Some would speak of the relief they felt when the orders to stop finally arrived. Others would speak of the strange emptiness that came with knowing the long struggle was over. All of them would remember the sea, the cold, the darkness, the sound of water rushing into a scuttled hull, the sight of an Allied ship approaching with a white flag flying. The sea had been their battlefield and their judge. In the end it had released them, not because they had won but because the larger war had moved on without them. The boats were gone. The packs were gone. The men who had sailed in them were left with the memories and with the long, uncertain peace that lay ahead. The Atlantic remained, vast and cold and waiting, but for the first time in years it was no longer trying to kill them. It was simply the sea again, and the war was over. The man who had once commanded the wolves of the Atlantic now sat in a courtroom in a defeated city, facing judgment not from the sea but from men who had never felt the hull of a submarine shudder under depth charges. He had spent years believing that the submarines under his command could still decide the outcome of the war. He had watched them leave port with high hopes and return with fewer and fewer successes. He had signed the orders that sent young men into the cold water again and again, and he had read the reports that told him how many of those men would never come home. Now he sat behind a wooden table in Nuremberg, wearing a simple uniform without rank insignia, and listened as lawyers argued about whether the way he had fought the war at sea had been a crime. The room was filled with the quiet tension of people who understood that history itself was being weighed in these proceedings. He kept his posture straight and his expression composed, the same way he had stood on the bridges of his boats in rough seas. Inside, the weight of everything he had lost pressed down on him with a force no courtroom could measure. The charges against him centered on the conduct of the submarine war. The prosecutors spoke of unrestricted attacks on merchant shipping, of orders that had allowed boats to surface and fire on survivors in the water, of a campaign that had treated the sea as a place where the normal rules of war did not apply. They presented documents and testimony that described the suffering of merchant seamen whose ships had been torpedoed far from help. They spoke of the families who had received telegrams and of the men who had died in lifeboats or in the cold Atlantic because no one had come for them in time. The words were formal and precise, but behind them lay the human reality of years of loss on both sides of the ocean. Dönitz listened without visible reaction. He had prepared for this moment. He had spent long hours with his defense lawyers going over every order he had given and every report he had received. He knew that the prosecution would try to paint him as a man who had waged war without limits. He also knew that the defense would argue that the sea war had been fought under conditions that no one in a courtroom could fully understand. When it was his turn to speak, he stood and answered the questions put to him with the same calm precision he had once used to direct his boats. He explained that the decision to attack merchant ships without warning had come only after the British had armed their merchant vessels and ordered them to report submarine sightings. He spoke of the difficulty of distinguishing between a harmless freighter and one that was acting as a scout for the enemy. He did not try to deny that terrible things had happened. He simply said that in the kind of war the Atlantic had become, the old rules had proven impossible to maintain. There were moments in the trial when the human cost on both sides became impossible to ignore. Former U-boat men who had been called as witnesses spoke of the fear that had gripped their crews when depth charges rolled overhead for hours. They described the way the air grew thick and the lights flickered and the hull seemed to close in around them. They spoke of the friends who had not come back from patrols and of the letters they had written to families who would never receive them. One man, a petty officer who had survived the worst months of 1943, described how his boat had been forced to dive again and again while aircraft hunted them across the Bay of Biscay. He did not raise his voice or try to defend every action his commanders had taken. He simply said that they had done what they believed was necessary to stay alive and to carry out their orders. When he finished speaking, he looked across the courtroom at the man who had once been his commander. For a brief moment their eyes met, and something passed between them that no lawyer could put into words. On the other side of the same courtroom, Allied naval officers testified about the losses their own side had suffered. They spoke of convoys that had been scattered by massed attacks and of the men who had died trying to bring supplies across the ocean. They described the fear that had gripped merchant seamen every time they left port and the way families had waited for news that sometimes never came. One officer, a man who had commanded an escort group through the hardest months of the campaign, spoke quietly about the night his own ship had been torpedoed. He had been pulled from the water by his crew and had watched from a lifeboat as his ship went down. He did not speak with hatred. He simply said that the sea war had been brutal on everyone who fought it and that the men who had served in submarines had faced dangers as real as any faced by the men who had tried to hunt them. Dönitz's own losses were never far from the surface of the proceedings, even when they were not directly mentioned. He had buried 2 sons during the war. One had been killed in a surface ship action early on. The other had gone down with his submarine in the final months of the campaign. The grief he carried was private, but it showed in the way he sometimes paused before answering a question about the men who had served under him. He had written letters to the families of those who had not returned, just as he had once written to his own wife about the sons they had lost. In the courtroom he did not speak of those personal losses. He spoke instead of the duty he had felt toward every man who had volunteered for the submarine service and of the responsibility he still felt for having asked so much of them. The defense arguments turned often on the question of what was fair to demand of men fighting a total war at sea. Lawyers pointed out that the Allies themselves had eventually adopted many of the same practices they now condemned. They noted that British and American submarines in the Pacific had waged war against Japanese merchant shipping with few restrictions and that the same arguments about distinguishing between warships and merchant vessels had been made on both sides. They argued that holding one admiral responsible for the entire conduct of a campaign fought under conditions no one had anticipated was to apply standards that had not existed when the fighting began. Dönitz listened to these arguments without comment. He had never expected the trial to be easy. He had only hoped that the men who judged him would understand something of the world in which he had made his decisions. There were quieter moments in the long days of testimony when the human reality of the war at sea came through in small, personal details. A former crew member described how his boat had once surfaced after an attack to look for survivors in the water. He spoke of the men they had pulled from the sea and of the way they had shared what little food and water they had until they could transfer the survivors to another vessel. He did not claim that every boat had acted this way. He simply said that the men he had served with had tried to remember that the enemy were also men with families waiting for them. When he finished speaking, he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the length of his testimony. The weight of the years he had carried was visible in the way he held himself as he left the witness stand. Dönitz's final statement to the court was brief and direct. He said that he had done his duty as he understood it and that he accepted the responsibility that came with command. He did not ask for mercy or claim that he had been unaware of the suffering the submarine war had caused. He simply stated that he had believed the survival of his country depended on the success of the boats under his command and that he had done everything in his power to achieve that success. When he sat down, the courtroom was quiet for a moment. The judges had heard months of testimony about the conduct of the war at sea. They had listened to arguments about law and morality and the terrible choices that total war forces upon those who fight it. Now they would have to decide what justice required in a case where the line between necessary action and criminal conduct was not always clear. The sentence, when it came, was 10 years in prison. It was lighter than many had expected and heavier than some had hoped. Dönitz received the news with the same composure he had maintained throughout the trial. He had known that some form of punishment was likely. He had also known that the arguments about the nature of the sea war had carried weight with at least some of the judges. In the years that followed, while he served his sentence, he received letters from former crew members and from families of men who had not survived. Some thanked him for his leadership. Others wrote simply to say that they remembered the men they had served with and that the years at sea had changed them in ways no courtroom could ever fully understand. He answered as many of those letters as he could, always with the same quiet dignity that had marked his command. The trial had not resolved every question about the morality of the submarine war. It had not erased the suffering of the men who had died in the water or the grief of the families who had waited in vain for news. It had, however, forced a reckoning with the reality that modern war at sea had created its own brutal logic, one that did not fit neatly into the legal frameworks that had existed before the fighting began. Dönitz had been judged not only for what he had done but for what he had come to represent, the face of a campaign that had once seemed capable of deciding the war and that had ultimately cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides of the ocean. The men who had served under him carried their own judgments and the memories they kept of the boats they had lived in and the friends they had lost. Some would speak of those years with pride in what they had endured together. Others would speak of them with sorrow for what the sea had taken and for the dream that had ended in a courtroom far from the water they had once called home. If the complex human reality behind the trial, the grief carried by a commander who had lost his own sons, the quiet endurance of crews who had done their duty under impossible conditions, and the moral questions that no courtroom could fully settle, has left you wanting to see the unfiltered cost of the campaign that was being judged, then our special Gumroad collection holds raw, uncensored photographs and rare footage from the U-Boat War. These images capture the true face of submarine warfare in ways that words alone cannot convey, offering an unflinching look at the courage, the destruction, and the quiet aftermath that shaped so many lives. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The admiral who had once directed the movements of the Wolfpacks now carried the judgment of men who had never known the inside of a submarine or the sound of depth charges rolling through the water. He accepted that judgment with the same sense of duty that had shaped his entire life. The sea had already rendered its own verdict in the form of the thousands of men who had never returned from patrol. The courtroom had rendered another. Between those two verdicts lay the long, difficult truth that wars fought at sea create their own rules and that those rules rarely survive the return to peace unchanged. The men who had lived through the campaign carried both verdicts with them into whatever future remained. Some found ways to live with the weight. Others spent the rest of their lives trying to understand how the dream that had once seemed so clear could have led to a courtroom in a ruined city and to questions that no one had fully known how to answer. The war at sea had ended. The reckoning had begun. And the sea, as always, remained silent about the judgments men passed on one another in its name. They called them iron coffins, these steel tubes that took young men beneath the waves and too often never brought them back, and the sea kept a terrible accounting of how many would never see home again. The men who volunteered for the submarine service in the early years had heard the whispers. They knew that the boats were small and the dangers were many. Depth charges could crush a hull from a distance that felt impossibly close. Aircraft could appear without warning and turn the surface into a killing ground. Even a successful attack could leave a crew stranded far from help if something went wrong. Yet they stepped forward anyway. Some came from families with naval traditions. Others were drawn by the promise of elite service and the chance to strike back in a war that had already taken so much from their country. A young man from a small town who had never seen the ocean stood in a recruitment office and signed his name without hesitation. He had read about the aces of the previous war and imagined that courage and skill could protect a man even in the deepest water. His mother cried when he told her, but she packed his bag and slipped a small photograph into the pocket of his civilian coat. She asked him to write when he could. He promised he would. The reality of life inside those boats settled over the crews quickly. The air grew thick after only a few hours submerged. Men learned to move through the narrow passageways without brushing against one another too often. They slept in shifts on damp bunks and ate meals that tasted of diesel and metal. The constant awareness that one mistake or one unlucky depth charge could end everything created a strange kind of closeness. A petty officer who had served on surface ships before volunteering for submarines noticed how the men watched out for one another in small ways. Someone would quietly pass an extra piece of bread to a shipmate who had been on watch too long. Another would stay up an extra hour to talk with a younger man who could not sleep after a difficult patrol. These gestures did not change the odds. They simply made the waiting and the fear more bearable. The losses began early and never truly stopped. A boat that left port with a full crew might return weeks later with empty bunks and stories that the survivors did not want to tell. Families received telegrams that said little and explained nothing. A mother in a small apartment opened one such message and sat at her kitchen table for a long time before she could bring herself to read the words again. Her son had been lost at sea. There were no details about how or where. She folded the telegram carefully and placed it in a drawer with the letters he had sent from training. She did not cry in front of her other children. She simply went about the ordinary tasks of the day and waited for the grief to find its own time. On the boats that survived, the men learned to live with the knowledge that most of them would not make it through the war. They did not speak of it often, but it shaped the way they treated one another. A commander who had already lost one crew to a depth charge attack made a point of learning the names and stories of every new man who joined his boat. He wrote letters to families when someone was lost, not because it was required but because he could not bear the thought of a mother or wife waiting without any word at all. The letters were short and formal, but they carried the weight of shared loss. One such letter reached a small town where a young widow was raising 2 children alone. She read it by the light of a single lamp and then placed it with the few belongings her husband had left behind. She did not know the commander who had written it, but she felt a strange connection to the man who had tried to give her husband back to her in words when the sea had taken everything else. The psychological cost was as real as the physical one, though it was harder to measure. Men who had once laughed easily in the mess grew quieter after too many close calls. A young rating who had joined full of excitement found himself waking in the middle of the night with his heart racing even when the boat was safely tied up in port. He did not tell anyone. He simply did his work and tried to hide the shaking in his hands when depth charges were mentioned. An older hand who had noticed the change sat with him one evening after a long watch and spoke quietly about his own first patrol and how the fear had never entirely gone away. He did not offer advice or false comfort. He simply said that the sea asked more of some men than others and that surviving did not always mean coming home whole. The younger man listened and felt, for the first time in weeks, that he was not alone in carrying the weight. On the other side of the ocean, the human price was paid in different but equally devastating ways. Merchant seamen who had signed on for steady work and the chance to see the world found themselves crossing waters where submarines waited in the dark. A ship could be torpedoed without warning, and the men aboard had only minutes to abandon before the sea claimed everything. Survivors spoke later of the cold that seemed to reach inside their bones and of the way oil from ruptured tanks turned the water into a burning nightmare. Families waited for ships that never arrived. A wife in a coastal town received news that her husband's vessel had been lost with all hands. She sat with their young daughter on her lap and tried to find words that would make sense of something that made no sense at all. The child asked when her father would come home. The mother answered that he was watching over them from a place where the sea could not reach. It was the only comfort she could offer. The small acts of heroism that emerged from these losses often went unnoticed by anyone except the men who lived through them. On one torpedoed merchant ship, a stoker stayed at his post long enough to shut down the engines and prevent a larger explosion, giving his shipmates extra minutes to reach the lifeboats. He did not survive. On a submarine that had been depth-charged for hours, a young crew member gave his life jacket to an injured shipmate who could not swim well. The older man survived. The younger one did not. These moments did not change the overall odds. They simply reminded everyone involved that even in the worst circumstances, ordinary men could still choose to look after one another. The survivors who made it through carried the memory of those who had not in ways that shaped the rest of their lives. A petty officer who had served on 3 different boats and watched 2 of them go down found it difficult to return to ordinary work after the war. He would wake in the night and reach for the bulkhead that was no longer there. His wife learned to leave a light on in the hallway and to sit with him when the shaking started. She did not ask questions he could not answer. She simply stayed until the fear passed. On the other side of the same ocean, a merchant seaman who had survived 3 sinkings and spent weeks in open boats found himself unable to look at the sea without feeling the old cold in his bones. He moved inland and took a job far from any harbor. His children grew up never knowing why their father refused to take them to the beach. The human price of the campaign was measured not only in the men who died but in the families who were left to carry the absence for decades afterward. A mother who had already buried one son received word that her second son, who had followed him into the submarine service, would not be coming home either. She sat at her kitchen table with 2 telegrams in her hands and did not know how to continue. Neighbors brought food and sat with her in silence. There were no words that could fill the space her sons had left. On the Allied side, a convoy commodore who had lost too many ships and too many friends found himself unable to speak of the war even years later. His grandchildren knew only that he sometimes stared out the window at nothing and that certain sounds made him go very still. They learned not to ask. The men who had lived inside the iron coffins and the men who had tried to hunt them shared more than either side wanted to admit. Both had faced the same cold water and the same fear of being left behind. Both had written letters that tried to sound braver than they felt. Both had lost friends whose names they still carried in quiet moments. When the war finally ended, the survivors on every side returned to a world that could never fully understand what they had lived through. Some found ways to speak of it. Most did not. The sea had taken what it wanted and left the rest to carry the memory in whatever way they could manage. If the quiet endurance of these men and the families who waited for them, the small kindnesses that held crews together in the worst hours, the letters that tried to bridge the distance between sea and home, and the long shadow that loss cast over the decades that followed, has moved you, and if you want to help keep these voices alive, then there is a simple way to make a real difference. You can leave a small tip, even just $1, on Ko-Fi to help sustain the countless hours of research, survivor interviews, and careful storytelling required to bring these forgotten chapters back into the light. It truly helps. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The iron coffins had done their work. They had carried young men into the depths and too often kept them there. The sea had claimed its terrible share on every side of the conflict, and the families who remained carried the absence long after the boats had rusted away and the telegrams had been folded away in drawers. There was no victory that could bring back the ones who had been lost and no accounting that could fully measure what the war at sea had taken from ordinary people who had only wanted to do their duty and come home. The men who had survived learned to live with the weight they carried. Some found peace in the knowledge that they had done what was asked of them. Others never stopped wondering why they had been the ones to return when so many others had not. The sea itself offered no answers. It simply moved on, vast and cold and indifferent to the judgments men passed on the cost of the battles fought upon its surface. The human price had been paid in full, and the only thing left was the long work of remembering. Long after the last torpedo was fired and the final boat was scuttled or surrendered, the echoes of the Wolfpacks lingered in the steel of new submarines, and the doctrines of modern navies, and most enduringly in the quiet memories of the men who had lived through the abyss. The war at sea had ended without ceremony for most of the survivors. They stepped ashore in ports that no longer felt like home or were taken aboard Allied ships that treated them with the weary courtesy of men who had seen too much themselves. Some wrote letters in the first weeks of peace that tried to explain what they had seen and done, but the words never seemed large enough. A young man who had spent 3 years inside the same steel tube sat at a kitchen table far from the coast and stared at a blank sheet of paper for hours. He wanted to tell his family about the nights when the hull had shuddered and the air had grown thick, about the friends who had not come back, and about the strange, hollow feeling that had settled over him once the orders to stop finally arrived. In the end, he wrote only that he was safe and that he hoped to see them soon. The letter was folded carefully and placed in a drawer. He would try again another day, when the right words came. The boats themselves were gone. Those that had not been sunk in the final weeks were scuttled by their own crews or taken into Allied ports to be studied and then broken up. In the years that followed, the steel from some of them found its way into new ships and new submarines, as if the material itself carried a memory of what it had once been asked to do. Engineers who examined the few Type XXI boats that had reached operational status noted the streamlined hulls and the large battery capacity that allowed longer periods submerged. They took those lessons and applied them to the next generation of submarines. The men who had sailed in those boats never saw the submarines their experiences helped shape. They were busy learning how to live in a world that no longer needed them to hunt or to hide. For many survivors, the return to ordinary life proved more difficult than the patrols had been. A petty officer who had once kept his crew steady through hours of depth charges found himself unable to sleep in a quiet bedroom. The absence of the constant background hum of the diesels and the distant sound of the sea against the hull left a silence that felt wrong. He took long walks at night and sometimes stood by the water, listening to the waves and trying to remember which sounds had once meant safety and which had meant danger. His wife learned to leave a small light burning and to sit with him when the shaking started. She did not ask what he was remembering. She simply stayed until the fear passed and the ordinary world returned. On the other side of the same ocean, men who had spent the war trying to protect the convoys carried their own memories. A former escort commander who had lost ships and friends to the packs found it difficult to speak of the victory he was supposed to feel. He had done his duty, and he had seen the enemy defeated, yet the cost had been measured in young men on both sides who would never grow old. He visited a small memorial years later and stood for a long time in front of the names carved into stone. Some of those names belonged to men he had tried to hunt. Others belonged to men who had served with him. He did not distinguish between them in his mind. They had all been caught in the same cold water, and the sea had not cared which side they fought for. The technological legacy of the campaign was visible in the submarines that followed. The lessons learned about underwater speed, endurance, and the importance of staying hidden shaped the designs that would dominate the Cold War. Men who had once struggled with the limitations of battery power and the need to surface for air watched as new boats emerged that could remain submerged for weeks at a time. They understood the irony. The same sea that had nearly destroyed them had also taught the world how to build better machines for fighting beneath its surface. Some of the survivors felt a quiet pride that their suffering had contributed to something larger, even if that something was another generation of submarines. Others felt only the weight of knowing that the next war, if it came, would be fought by men who had never smelled diesel in a cramped control room or listened to the slow, steady ping of an active sonar searching for them. The doctrinal changes were equally profound. Navies that had once treated submarines as raiders now built entire fleets around them. Hunter-killer groups that had been improvised in the middle of the war became permanent parts of the order of battle. Aircraft that had learned to hunt surfaced boats with radar and searchlights evolved into platforms capable of tracking and attacking submarines across entire oceans. The men who had lived through the long months when air cover was thin and convoys were scattered watched these developments with a mixture of professional interest and private unease. They knew better than most how quickly the advantage could shift when one side learned to see what the other tried to hide. There were reunions in the decades that followed. Former U-boat men met in small halls and spoke of the patrols that had defined their youth. They brought photographs and letters and sometimes the small tokens they had carried through the war. The conversations were not always easy. Some men still carried anger about the way the war had ended and the judgments that had been passed in courtrooms far from the sea. Others had made peace with what they had done and what had been done to them. They spoke of the friends who had not returned and of the strange bond that had formed between men who had shared the same cramped spaces and the same fear. When the gatherings ended, they returned to their ordinary lives carrying the same memories but feeling, for a few hours at least, less alone with them. On the Allied side there were similar gatherings. Men who had served in escorts and on merchant ships met to remember the convoys and the nights when the sea had seemed full of enemies. They spoke of the relief when the attacks finally stopped and of the quiet pride in having kept the lifelines open. Some of them had lost brothers or sons to the submarines. Others had pulled German survivors from the water and treated them with the same care they would have given their own shipmates. These stories were told without drama, as if the men were describing ordinary work rather than extraordinary endurance. The sea had asked much of them, and they had answered in the only way they knew how. The moral questions raised by the campaign did not disappear with the passing of years. The debate over what was permissible in a war fought beneath the surface continued in books and in quiet conversations between men who had once been enemies. Some argued that the nature of submarine warfare made the old rules impossible to follow. Others insisted that certain lines should never be crossed, no matter how desperate the circumstances. The men who had actually lived through the fighting rarely took strong positions in these debates. They had seen too much to believe that simple rules could capture the complexity of what happened when steel tubes met depth charges and when ordinary sailors found themselves fighting for their lives in the dark. They carried their own judgments in private and spoke of them only to those who had shared the same experiences. There were moments of unexpected connection across the old divisions. A former U-boat commander met years later with a man who had once commanded an escort that had hunted his boat. They sat together in a small cafe and spoke of the nights when each had tried to kill the other. The conversation was not angry. It was the talk of two men who had done their duty in a war that had demanded more than either of them had expected to give. When they parted, they shook hands without ceremony. Neither claimed victory or asked for forgiveness. They simply acknowledged that they had both survived something larger than either of them and that the sea had been indifferent to which side they had fought for. The fascination with the campaign endured long after the last survivor had gone. Museums preserved boats that had once carried men into danger. Books and films told stories of the patrols and the battles, sometimes with more drama than accuracy. Young people who had never smelled diesel or felt the hull shudder under attack visited memorials and tried to imagine what it had been like. The stories they heard were often simplified, stripped of the small kindnesses and the quiet failures that had made up so much of the real experience. The men who had lived through it watched these retellings with a mixture of amusement and sadness. They knew that no story could fully capture what it had felt like to wait in the dark while the sea tried to decide whether you would live or die. In quiet moments, many of the survivors returned to the water. They stood on shores or walked along docks and looked out at the same sea that had once been their battlefield. Some spoke to it in the privacy of their own thoughts, telling it about the men it had taken and about the lives that had continued despite everything. Others simply stood in silence, letting the sound of the waves replace the memories that had grown too loud. A man who had once commanded a boat that never returned from its final patrol visited the coast every year on the anniversary of its loss. He brought no flowers and made no speeches. He simply stood where the land met the water and remembered the faces of the men who had trusted him with their lives. When he turned to leave, the sea was exactly as it had been when he arrived, vast, cold, and unchanged by anything men had done upon its surface. The Wolfpacks had left behind more than rusting hulls and faded photographs. They had left a generation of men who had learned, in the hardest possible way, what it meant to trust one another in the dark. They had left families who carried absence as a permanent part of their lives. They had left navies that understood the power and the limits of submarines in ways they had not understood before. And they had left questions about the conduct of war that would be asked again whenever nations sent men beneath the waves to fight. The answers would never be simple. The sea did not offer answers. It simply waited, as it always had, for the next generation to learn what the last generation had discovered, that courage and skill could not protect a man from everything, that ordinary people could still choose to look after one another when everything else was falling apart, and that the stories worth remembering were not always the ones about victory. If the quiet persistence of these memories, the way ordinary men carried the weight of what they had seen and done, the small connections that formed across old divisions, and the lessons that shaped the navies and the questions that followed, has left you wanting to go deeper into the human reality behind the machines and the battles, then our Patreon community is built exactly for that. History lovers there gain access to uncensored deep dive podcasts, raw video segments without blurring, exclusive collections of survivor letters, and a warm circle of fellow enthusiasts who refuse to let these stories fade. It is a place where the full weight of what these men lived through can be explored together with others who feel the same pull. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The Abyss had claimed its share, but it had not claimed everything. The men who had returned carried their memories forward, not as burdens to be hidden but as stories that deserve to be told. They spoke of the fear and the courage, of the small kindnesses and the quiet failures, of the sea that had been both enemy and companion. They spoke of the friends who had not come home and of the strange peace that sometimes came with knowing they had done what was asked of them until the asking stopped. The Wolfpacks were gone. The iron coffins had rusted or been broken up. The patrols that had once seemed capable of deciding the fate of nations had become chapters in books and names on memorials. What remained was the human story, the story of ordinary people who had been asked to do extraordinary things and who had answered in the only ways they knew how. That story did not end with the last boat or the last telegram. It continued in the lives of those who remembered and in the questions they passed on to those who came after. The sea remained vast and cold and waiting. The men who had once trusted their lives to its surface had learned what it meant to live with its judgment. And the echoes of their time in the abyss would continue, quiet but persistent, for as long as anyone still cared to listen.